Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're heading back to a place that's all dust and drama, six-shooters and saloons, where justice is questionable, the whiskey is watered down and life expectancy is, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this. Yep, welcome to the Wild West. But don't expect a heroic showdown at high noon or a ride into the sunset on your faithful steed. No, tonight we're slipping down the back alleys, past the swinging saloon doors and the gambling tables, until we hit the places where the piano plays low, the laughter's a little forced, and perfume can't quite mask the scent of whiskey and sweat. We're talking about the forgotten life of prostitutes in the Wild West, the soiled doves, the painted ladies, the women who history either erased or reduced to clichés. But there's a whole world here, a complicated, layered world full of grit, resilience, and stories that deserve to be told. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing that, especially if it's way too late and you're supposed to be asleep already. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the stagecoach, boots hitting the dusty street of a small but noisy mining town, somewhere out west, mid-1800s. You don't even know the name. Could be Deadwood, could be Dodge City, it doesn't matter. The bones are the same. There's a main street that runs like a scar through the centre of town, framed by wooden buildings leaning like tired men. The mountains loom to the west, the sky is a blistering blue, and everything smells like horses, pine smoke, and unwashed men. You're here with a purpose, or at least you tell yourself that. Maybe you've got $5 to your name. Maybe you've got a past you're trying to leave behind, or maybe, like a lot of people, you've followed the promise of the West without asking what it costs. From your right, the high-pitched laughter of women cuts through the noise of hammers and carts. You glance over and see them, 3 women in bright silks, standing on a wooden balcony above a saloon, watching the street like queens surveying a half-broken kingdom. One waves lazily, the rings on her fingers glinting. She's older. Face powdered, hair piled high. A man below throws his hat in the air and stumbles inside. You wonder briefly what her story is. It doesn't take long to figure out the structure of the town. There's the respectable side, the church, the general store, the sheriff's office, thin walls and thinner morals. Then there's the other side, down by the river, near the tent camps and stables. The cribs stretch in a ragged line, small one-room shacks with faded curtains and women sitting in doorways, smoking, waiting. And of course, there's the brothels. Fancy ones, hidden behind saloons or nestled upstairs, run by women who walk a tightrope between legitimacy and the law. They're madams. They keep order, collect rent, and sometimes run things more smoothly than the actual mayor. You find yourself watching a girl barely older than you, maybe 16 tall, maybe lying about her age, as she sweeps the front step of a parlour house. Her hair's still soft around the face, but her eyes are hard. She glances up and offers a smirk, not a smile, and keeps sweeping. She's one of hundreds, maybe thousands. This isn't the West you saw in books. There are no John Waynes, no gallant sheriffs protecting damsels. The real West is raw, diverse, and unforgiving. And for the women who made their way here, many with no family, no protection, and no other option, prostitution wasn't always a last resort. Sometimes it was the only way forward. Here's your first historical truth. Prostitution in the Wild West wasn't an exception, it was a core part of the economy. In boomtowns where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, the sex trade flourished openly. Entire towns were built on the backs of miners, gamblers, and railroad workers, and they brought their vices with them. Brothels, saloons, and gambling halls weren't on the fringe. They were the economy. Some madams even loaned money to local banks. Quirky fact? Brothels were often the first buildings in a new town to have indoor plumbing. True story. In places where the sheriff's office was still using an outhouse, the ladies upstairs had flushing toilets and bathtubs. Hygiene wasn't just luxury, it was business. As you wander through town, a debate stirs in the back of your mind, something historians still argue about today. Were these women victims of their circumstances, or empowered entrepreneurs making the best of a brutal world? You'll find arguments for both. Some were trafficked, some tricked, some trapped by poverty, others built empires, dodged marriage, and carved a strange kind of freedom out of a society that offered them none. You stop in front of a saloon and watch as a group of cowboys emerge, hooting and stumbling. One throws a coin to a girl perched on a window ledge. She catches it without smiling. And you wonder, just for a moment, what her real name is. Not Rose or Candy or Miss Kitty. The name her mother called her when she was 5, before the war, before the famine, before she stepped on a train and ended up here. Then the piano starts playing, someone's already drunk enough to sing off key. The doors swing open, the gaslights flicker, and the night begins. You wouldn't call it glamorous, but there's something hypnotic about the way the West draws people in, especially women with nowhere else to go. You've barely been here a few days, and already the rhythm of the town has pulled you under like a slow-moving current. Sun-bleached mornings, smoky afternoons, and nights that smell like spilled beer, perfume, and regret. That's when the soiled doves come out. Women who, like you, didn't necessarily choose this life but found it waiting all the same. The West was expanding like an unchecked fire in the late 1800s. Gold, silver, land, railroads. It was all up for grabs, and people came from everywhere to claim a piece. But while men poured in to dig, fight, and build, women followed in their shadows. Some were cooks or laundresses, some were wives or sisters dragged along behind wagons, and many, far more than the history books want to admit, arrived with no money, no safety net, and no prospects, except the ones that paid by the hour. You pass a rail stop one afternoon and watch a new group of women disembark. They look nervous. One's wearing a sun hat that might have once been white. Another clutches a small case so tightly her knuckles are white. They scan the town like it's a game board, and they've just been dropped into play. The older woman who meets them, bustled, corseted, and perfectly painted, smiles like a fox and leads them away. Most of them won't last long. The turnover is brutal. Some stay a few weeks and vanish, some die young, disease, violence, or simply worn down. But others will become fixtures. They'll pick up street names and regulars, and after a while, the new girls will look at them the same way they looked at the madam who met them today. Here's your historical fact for tonight. Between 1860 and 1890, prostitutes made up a shockingly high percentage of the adult female population in boomtowns. In some places, like Virginia City or Tombstone, they were as much as 20 to 30% of all women in town. Their presence wasn't hidden. They lived in crib rows, walked openly, and were listed, sometimes euphemistically, sometimes bluntly, in city directories. You overhear 2 miners arguing about one of the newcomers. "She's fresh from St. Louis," one says. "Says she was a seamstress," the other snorts. "They're all seamstresses till they learn the ropes." They laugh and clink their mugs together, but the moment sticks with you. Because it's true, many of these women had once been seamstresses, or housemaids, or widows with hungry mouths to feed. But the West doesn't care much for backstories. You spend a few evenings watching the ebb and flow of the town's pleasure districts. Saloons blare music, men come and go with lazy urgency, and upstairs the real business begins. In a parlour house, the upper tier of the trade, women dress in silk and velvet, entertain clients with conversation, and sometimes dance or play piano. There's a sense of formality here. The madam runs it like a hotel. The girls have rooms, meals, and, if they're lucky, a doctor who visits once a month. Down by the river, though, it's different. The cribs are narrow, windowless rooms built in long rows like a grim motel. The women here don't wear velvet. They wear whatever they can afford or repair. Men knock, pay, enter, and leave within minutes. There's no music, no pretending, just a chair, a bed, and survival. One quirky fact. Some towns issued actual licenses to prostitutes. In places like Helena, Montana, and Butte, madams paid monthly fees to the city to keep their businesses legal-ish. That money went into the city treasury. One historian called them the unofficial tax backbone of several towns. So while local churches condemned them, and respectable women crossed the street to avoid them, the city was more than happy to take their money. You sit near the train station one morning and watch a girl eating cold biscuits from a paper sack. Her dress is torn at the hem, and her boots don't match. She's talking to another woman, older, sharper, who's telling her about the town, where to stay, who to avoid, how much to charge. You hear her say, "Just make it 6 months, get through the first 6 and you'll stop shaking." Maybe she's right. Some of the women arriving now are runaways. Others are immigrants, Irish, Chinese, Mexican, drawn west by false promises or forced into brothels against their will. The towns are lawless, but the trade is structured, sometimes with terrifying efficiency. In the bigger cities, syndicates traffic women from one town to another. You learn the names of the places they don't want to end up. Dead Man's Gulch, Skinner's Alley, Dogtown. Some call them working districts, others call them what they really are, human mills. And then there are the whispers, girls who disappear. Gior. No one investigates. Maybe they moved on, maybe they overdosed, or maybe some client decided they were worth less than the dollar he paid. These stories stay in the background, like cigarette smoke in a velvet room. No one says it out loud, but you can feel it. There's danger here, always humming just under the surface. Even with all this, some women come west willingly, even eagerly. Not for the money, not exactly, but for the space, for the anonymity. Back east, their reputations were ruined. Here, nobody cares where you came from. You can be a widow, a con artist, a debutante on the run. The West offers something rare for women in the 19th century, the chance to rewrite yourself. But historians still can't agree on the ethics of it all. Some argue that the myth of the empowered frontier prostitute is just that, a myth. Others push back, saying that while it was dangerous and exploitative, many women did seize control of their circumstances. The truth, like always, sits somewhere in the messy middle. As the sun goes down, you walk past a red curtain fluttering in a second-story window. Laughter echoes faintly through the dry evening air. You stop just for a second and look up. You don't know who's in that room. Maybe she's crying, maybe she's bored, maybe she's laughing because it's the only way to stay sane. You don't know her story yet, but you will. It doesn't take long before you notice a pattern in who really holds the reins in this town, not the sheriff, not the mayor, not the boys with guns slung low on their hips. It's the women who own the doors that never close, the women who smile without blinking and speak softly while everyone else is yelling. Madams. You hear their names whispered with respect, caution, and sometimes a little fear. They aren't just part of the economy, they are the economy. Tonight you find yourself inside one of the more well-established parlour houses. The wallpaper is peeling in a few corners, but the lace curtains are clean, and the gaslight flickers gold against polished wood. The madam here is a woman named Pearl, with a voice like smoke and a way of making you feel like you owe her money, even when you don't. She's not young, probably hasn't been for some time. Her corset is tighter than necessary, her jewellery heavy, and her perfume arrives in a room before she does. But there's steel beneath all that powder. Pearl's girls don't talk much when she's around. They watch her the way sailors watch the sky. You sit on a worn velvet chair near the corner, pretending to drink, pretending to be invisible. Pearl is at the desk, going over accounts. Coins clink, and someone hands her a pouch. She weighs it in her hand, nods, and tucks it away. Later, you'll learn that she owns part of the saloon downstairs, has 2 deputies on her payroll, and rents out half the block of rooms behind the building. That's your historical fact. Many madams in the West weren't just successful, they were some of the wealthiest people in town. They paid higher taxes than most businesses, donated to schools and hospitals, and in some cases, wielded more political influence than elected officials. In Helena, Montana, a madam named Josephine Eerie, better known as Chicago Joe, not only owned her brothel, she ran an entire entertainment district, invested in real estate and hosted political events. Politicians came to her, not the other way around. But before you get the wrong idea, it wasn't all power and pearls. These women had to fight for every inch. Laws changed constantly, often just to make their lives harder. Churches pushed for closures, vigilantes threatened violence. And if a madame grew too successful, or crossed the wrong man, her empire could vanish overnight. Still, some endured. Built little empires, brick by brick. Women like Mattie Silks in Denver or Julia Bulette in Virginia City, whose clientele included lawmakers, judges, and business tycoons. You notice that Pearl runs her house like a captain at sea, tight ship, no nonsense. Her girls pay room and board, a cut of their earnings, and even fines for breaking house rules. But in return they get security, or at least as close to it as you can find in this place. If a man gets rough, Pearl handles it. If a girl gets sick, Pearl knows a doctor. And if a deputy comes sniffing for bribes, Pearl already has an envelope ready. Down the block, there's a rival house owned by a woman named Violet, younger, flashier, a little wild. Her parlour has a piano player who drinks more than he plays, and a chandelier that's definitely hung by wire. Violet lets her girls wear whatever they want and talk back to customers. You walk through once, just to look. It's louder, less refined, but packed. Violet herself is behind the bar, laughing with a man twice her size. She wears pants under her skirt, you notice, and carries a small pistol hidden in her waistband. Smart. Here's a quirky detail. Some madams became local legends not just for their wealth, but for their eccentricities. One in Colorado had a pet parrot that cussed in 5 languages. Another rode through town in a white carriage drawn by goats instead of horses. Some collected art. One famously owned a bear. Yes, an actual bear. These women, uninvited to polite society, created their own rules and sometimes their own spectacle. But not everyone in town is clapping. Across the street from Violet's, there's a storefront church. You hear singing echo out on Sunday mornings, hymns rising through the wind. The preacher doesn't name names, but his message is clear. Sin lives right across the road. And while some folks agree, others know better. The madams donate food, help after fires, pay for orphans' medicine. The preacher prays, the madam writes checks. The scholarly debate here gets sticky. Were these women uplifting their workers, or just better at making a profit off desperation? Some historians say madams gave their girls stability, fair pay, and protection, unheard of luxuries at the time. Others argue that it was still a form of exploitation, just dressed in satin. There's truth on both sides, and maybe the real answer depends on the woman, the town, and the day. Pearl catches your eye on your way out. She doesn't smile, just gives you that look, half warning, half appraisal. You wonder how many people she's seen come through her doors, how many stories she's kept locked behind that red-painted smile. She taps her fingers on the edge of her desk and then returns to her ledger. Outside, the town feels louder. The clatter of hooves, the creak of signs in the dry wind, men arguing near the poker tables, and laughter spilling from the open windows. The madams aren't just background figures in this chaos. They are the system. They know who's in town, who's lying low, who skipped out on rent. Their girls hear everything. Secrets, scandals, plans. If you want to know what's really going on, you don't ask the sheriff, you ask the woman upstairs. You pass by Violet's again on your way back. The piano is playing something vaguely cheerful, and someone's trying to harmonize from a floor above. You spot a young girl in a red corset leaning out the window, her eyes catching yours just for a moment. There's no seduction in her gaze, just boredom. She yawns, stretches, then disappears. Back in your room, you light a candle and sit on the edge of your creaky cot. You think about Pearl and Violet. 2 women running 2 very different ships, but both still afloat in this storm of town. The world outside their walls may not respect them, but inside, they rule. And that's no small thing. You're not exactly sure what you expected a brothel to look like on the inside. Maybe red velvet and chandeliers, maybe something seedier, darker. Stepping into one of the more refined parlour houses feels like entering a different universe entirely. The town outside is gritty and loud, but inside, everything is strangely soft. The lighting, the furniture, even the voices, which hover just above whispers. There's a haze in the air, cigar smoke mixed with perfume and the faintest trace of talcum powder. It settles into your clothes, into your skin. It's not unpleasant, just lived in. A woman glides past you in a sea-green dress that hugs her tightly enough to defy the laws of corsetry. She doesn't look at you, just adjusts the hairpin in her blonde curls and disappears behind a curtain that shimmers like fish scales. Somewhere upstairs, the faint strains of a piano tumble down the hallway, hesitant and slightly out of tune. A man laughs too loudly, and a woman's voice follows, low and coaxing. Everything about this place feels like it's leaning forward, like it's listening. You're led to a fainting couch by a girl named Lottie, who can't be older than 19 but carries herself like she's been here forever. She offers you a drink, whiskey or something that just tastes like it, and then, as you take the glass, she sits beside you and starts making casual conversation. Not about your needs or your wallet, but about the weather, the mining company strikes, and whether you've ever seen a man try to dance with his spurs still on. It hits you then. This is part of the job too, the art of ease. This place isn't just about sex, it's about performance, company, and creating the illusion that for a few hours, someone sees you. Here's a historical truth. High-class brothels in the Wild West often operated more like elite social clubs than dirty hideaways. The women who worked in them were sometimes referred to as courtesans or entertainers, and they were expected to be charming, literate, well-dressed, and socially clever. They read poetry, played piano, spoke French, some could even quote Shakespeare with a drawl. Clients came not just for the physical, but for the fantasy, a beautiful woman who listened, who laughed at your stories, who never interrupted. These places weren't cheap. A visit to a parlour house could cost a miner a week's wages. That's why most of the men you see lounging in the sitting room wear waistcoats with shiny buttons and boots that haven't touched a mineshaft in years. Lawyers, land speculators, travelling salesmen. Men who deal in words and promises. They sip brandy and pretend they're in Boston. Of course, you also learn quickly that everything is curated. The smell of cinnamon oil burning in the lamps, the piano that never stops playing even if no one listens, the mirrors placed just so to catch the softest angles. Nothing in this house is accidental, not even the broken things. Lottie tells you about the rotation, how the girls don't work every night in the same room, how the madam assigns them clients based on mood, personality, and sometimes how desperate the man seems. You're surprised by how businesslike it all sounds. There are ledgers, schedules, a system. Lottie laughs and says, "The girls down by the tracks think we're spoiled, and maybe we are. But this place takes a different kind of toll." Quirky fact for tonight. Some parlour houses had official house rules printed on little cards and framed in gold. No spitting, no fighting, no unclean boots. Men who broke the rules could be banned. And some madams had the town's toughest bouncers working their doors. In one famous case, a madam in San Francisco employed a retired boxer who weighed 300 pounds and liked to throw misbehaving clients into horse troughs. Cleaned them up 2 ways, you suppose. The rules didn't just apply to customers. The girls too had curfews, grooming expectations, quotas. Some madams were motherly, others cruel, but even in the nicest places, your time wasn't really yours. You might get a half day off if you weren't bleeding, bruised or sick. If you made enough to buy your freedom, you could leave, maybe. Sometimes. Lottie tells you about a girl who tried. Bought herself a train ticket east, packed her things and left with tears in her eyes. Came back 3 weeks later with her money stolen, her shoes gone, and a split lip. She said the real world was colder than the sheets here, Lottie says. At least here, we know the rules. There's an open debate among historians about whether parlour houses were really better for women or just better at hiding the ugly parts. Some argue they offered safety, community, and even a pathway to independence. Others say the illusion of glamour just made the exploitation harder to see. It's not an easy line to draw. You head upstairs with Lottie, not as a client but as an observer, and she shows you one of the rooms. The bed is iron-framed and neatly made, the linen surprisingly clean. There's a vanity with a cracked mirror and a drawer full of perfumes and powders. A trunk in the corner locked. On the windowsill or cell, a single wilted flower in a jar. Lottie says the trunk holds everything she owns, letters, shoes, a dress she bought and never wore. There's a photograph on the vanity, a man and a woman standing stiffly in front of a farmhouse. Lottie shrugs. "I think that's my cousin, or maybe my husband. I can't remember anymore." You ask if she ever thinks about leaving. She leans on the windowsill and watches the street below for a long time. Finally, she says, "What would I even do? Be someone's maid? Get yelled at for less money?" Then she smiles. "Nah, I'll stay until I'm too tired to keep climbing the stairs. Then maybe I'll sit at the desk like Miss Clara downstairs and let the young ones do the smiling." That night, as you walk back into the cool darkness of the street, you realise that places like this weren't hidden in the Wild West, they were central to it. These rooms, these women, this soft haze of music and perfume, it all formed the fabric of town life. Maybe people tried not to look directly at it, but everyone knew, everyone benefited, and yet somehow almost no one wrote it down. So much history is like that, built on the backs of women whose names never made it past the red velvet curtains. You're up early the next morning, too early actually. The saloons are still closed, the street's not quite baking yet, and there's a heavy quiet hanging in the air like the breath of something large and unseen. That's when you decide to walk toward the part of town everyone talks about, but no one really wants to be caught in after dark. It's not marked on a map, but you know when you're getting close. The buildings get smaller, cheaper, some aren't even real buildings, just patched up crates with tarps, like they were thrown together in an afternoon. Chickens wander between the alleys. A drunk snores in the shadow of a stack of barrels, and then you see them. The cribs. They line the alley like dominoes, neat and depressing. One-room shacks, mostly with warped doors and faded curtains in the windows. Red, sometimes pink, sometimes just a dirty white. Each one barely big enough to stand in. And still, behind every curtain, someone lives. Someone works. Someone waits. This is the lowest rung of the ladder. The part of the story people skip over. You walk slowly, the wooden boards creaking under your boots, and glance into one open door. There's a bed, a chipped pitcher of water, and a woman bent over, scrubbing the floor with her sleeves rolled up. She doesn't look at you, doesn't speak, just keeps scrubbing like she's trying to erase the whole place with a wet rag. Most of the women who live here don't have names that anybody remembers, not like the madams with their business cards and fur-lined cloaks. These women are known by nicknames, if they're known at all: Peach, Red, One-Eyed Lizzie. You spot one girl sitting on a wooden stoop with a shawl over her shoulders, smoking the stub of a cigarette. She watches you with a kind of cold detachment. Not hostile, just done. You imagine what her night looked like. How many knocks came to her door, how many times she had to pretend, smile, endure. Here's your historical fact for today. Cribs like these were the most common type of housing for prostitutes in the working class sections of western towns. They were called cribs, shacks, shanties, or more colourfully, snuggeries. Often built back to back, they allowed for maximum occupancy with minimum comfort. Rent was paid daily, and if a girl didn't earn enough that night, she might lose her space the next morning. No credit, no exceptions. Some cribs were owned by landlords or madams. Others were operated by pimps who took most of the earnings. But in many cases, women worked independently, running their own little corners of misery with nothing but a lock on the door and a knife under the bed. One quirky and honestly disturbing detail: some cribs were just converted train cars. The rail companies sold or scrapped them, and someone figured out they were just the right size to cram a bed and a body. So you'd walk through certain towns and see old passenger cars painted over in gaudy colours, lined up like a weird ghost train, each with a woman inside waiting. The differences between the parlour houses and the cribs aren't just about comfort, they're about power. In the parlour houses, madams set the terms. In the cribs, there's no buffer. The women here handle the money, the threats, the clients, all of it. They face the drunk men alone, the violent ones, the ones who want more than they paid for. And if something goes wrong, no one's calling for help, not even the sheriff, especially not the sheriff. You talk to a woman named Nettie, who's leaning against her doorframe in a faded dress that was probably beautiful once. She's older, with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that seem far away even when she's looking right at you. She asks if you've got a smoke. You hand her one and she lights it with a practiced flick. She tells you she's been here for 12 years, same shack, same bed. Some men treat you like a person, she says. Most don't, but that bed's mine, that lock's mine. I own the bolt on that door, and that's more than a lot of women get. You ask her if she ever worked in a parlour house. She snorts. They didn't want girls like me, I talk too much. I don't smile enough, got a scar down my back. No piano lessons, no pretty handwriting, so I built this life instead. You sit with her for a while and the street starts to wake up. A man walks by and nods at her. She rolls her eyes. That one never pays on time. Still thinks he's charming. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about women like Nettie, whether they were victims of failed systems or fiercely autonomous survivalists. One side says that women in cribs were exploited to the edge of collapse, often addicted, malnourished and physically abused. Another side insists that some women chose this arrangement over being controlled by a madam or married off to a drunk husband. The truth is, Nettie's story seems to have pieces of both. You pass another crib and hear coughing inside. A baby cries, sharp and sudden. You pause. Some of these women have children. Some hide them in back rooms, swaddled in borrowed cloth. Others pay an old woman down the road to watch them during the night, when the knocks don't stop coming. There's no daycare, no guarantees. Just hope the child doesn't get sick, say, doesn't wander, doesn't learn too soon what the knocks mean. You come across a row of cribs painted bright yellow, almost cheerfully so, and realise it was done intentionally to make the street seem more respectable when the governor visited 2 years ago. The paint is peeling now, exposing the grey wood beneath, like the buildings trying to remind everyone what it really is. And here's the unspoken rule. Everyone knows these cribs exist, but no one in town talks about them in the daylight. At night, they're full. By morning, the curtains are drawn, the women sleep, and the town pretends it's something else entirely. You head back into the main street feeling heavier than before. The contrast is jarring. The polished glass of the general store, the chatter outside the barber shop, the sweet smell of cinnamon buns from a kitchen you'll never be invited into. And just a few alleys away, women like Nettie are coughing through another morning, wiping down cracked mirrors, waiting to survive another day. They don't get to sit on Sunday church benches, they don't get their names etched on plaques, but the town is built on their labour just as much as it's built on the railroad and the mines. As you pass back under the swinging sign of the saloon, you think about how easily people forget what they step over on their way to respectability, and how hard it is to sleep in a crib with paper walls and nowhere else to go. It's hard not to think about the numbers. After a while, you start paying attention, not just to the faces or the rooms or the creaking floorboards, but the math of it all. How much a woman in a parlour house earns versus a girl in a crib, how much she spends on food, rent, laundry, medicine, how often she works, how many clients a night, how many hours of sleep. It all adds up, or rather, it doesn't. You start to realise that survival here is its own economy, and the rules are rigged. The West loves to sell itself as the land of opportunity, but you're beginning to see that it's really the land of hustle, and no one hustles harder than the women in the sex trade. You sit down one morning with a madam's ledger, not yours of course, but one you're allowed to glimpse through connections you won't name, and start decoding the scrawled entries. The math tells a story the town tries to ignore. Let's say a girl in a parlour house brings in $20 a night. That's high, only on busy weekends, and only with regulars. Out of that, she pays $5 to the house for room and board, $2 for laundry, another $2 for supplies, cosmetics, soap, whatever keeps her looking fresh. If she breaks a rule, say comes down late or refuses a client she's been assigned, she gets fined, maybe $5, maybe more. If she's on her period and can't work, she doesn't earn, but still pays for the room. And if she wants to save up enough to leave, well, she'd better be good with numbers. Your historical fact for the night: many prostitutes in the West were highly financially literate, because they had to be. Some ran complex accounting systems, tracked every coin, and kept coded ledgers to protect their earnings from theft, extortion, or jealous partners. A few even invested in land, lent money to businesses, or quietly bankrolled local campaigns. One former prostitute in Colorado became a prominent landlord, using savings from her work to buy up entire blocks of real estate. When the town tried to erase her name later, they found they couldn't, because she literally owned them. Meanwhile, down in the cribs, the math is even more brutal. Clients pay 50 cents to $1 depending on how desperate they are, or how desperate she is. Half of that goes to the landlord or the pimp, the rest barely covers food. One crib girl you meet, her name's Cora, with a birthmark on her cheek like a flick of soot, tells you she averages 8 to 10 men a night. You do the math, that's $4 to $5, minus the $2 she pays in rent, another one for food, another for clean water. On good nights, she can afford a new pair of stockings. On bad nights, she just drinks until it stops mattering. And here's your quirky fact: in some towns, prostitutes paid more in municipal fines than any other group. City governments, desperate for revenue, invented a dizzying list of vice penalties. Being out after curfew, $2. Public drunkenness, $3. Disorderly behaviour, a catch-all phrase that meant whatever the deputy wanted it to mean. 5. Some girls pay dozens of fines a month, effectively funding the very police departments that harassed them. The local jail, you learn, has a special ladies' cell. It's not special in any good way, just smaller, with rusted bars and an unspoken rule that you only get one blanket if you're not white. The girls get thrown in for a night too, sometimes more. They come out quieter, hungrier, and usually back on the street within an hour. There's no union, no retirement, no safety net. Some girls try to stash their earnings with bartenders or storekeepers, people they trust. But trust is dangerous here. One woman you meet, Lila, tells you her landlord stole her entire savings while she was laid up with pneumonia. Said I owed him for the medicine, she says, but I bought the medicine myself. She shrugs, lights a cigarette with trembling fingers and adds, learn not to get sick after that. Then there are the scams. A new girl arrives in town with a few coins to her name. The madam offers her a dress, a room, some perfume, everything on credit. You'll pay it off by Friday, she says sweetly. By Friday, the girl owes triple what she started with. Welcome to debt bondage. It wasn't rare. It was the norm. And yet, there's a strange pride that comes with knowing how to survive this world. You watch one woman, Minnie, a quiet powerhouse in a navy dress, negotiate her rates with 2 men at once. She leans against the doorframe, her arms crossed, calm as a banker. She knows her worth, she knows theirs too. They blink first. She raises her price. They still follow her upstairs. The scholarly debate here is sharp and ongoing. Was prostitution in the Old West a form of economic empowerment or a trap designed to keep women poor and dependent? Feminist historians on both sides argue it out. Some point to stories of women who saved, invested, and walked away rich. Others say those were exceptions, not rules. Most didn't escape, most barely made enough to eat. What's clear is that for many women, sex work offered a strange kind of financial clarity. There were no illusions, no promises of security or upward mobility, just the raw math of survival. One woman tells you, "At least I know where my next dollar's coming from." A married woman, she's got to wait for her husband to hand it over. You pass the local bank and notice something that hadn't occurred to you before. There are no women inside, not as clerks, not as customers, not even as shadows. The money in this town flows from the hands of women into the hands of men, and then back into the town through taxes, liquor, and bribes. The economy turns on a wheel built of silence and sweat. Back at the parlour house, the madam is counting her cut in the back room while her girls eat in the kitchen. Soup and crusty bread. You sit with them. One of the girls, Rosie, is sketching in the margin of an old newspaper. You ask if she ever thinks about opening a shop. "Sure," she says, not looking up. "But shops don't let you start with zero. This place does." You leave the table feeling a little stunned. You thought you were just telling stories, but really, you're walking through a world where every gesture has a price, every kindness is an investment, and every breath might cost more than you've got. The night falls fast and hot. Outside, the saloon windows glow orange, and the piano starts up again. You watch a girl count her coins one by one on the stoop, careful, focused, not rich, not yet, but not broken either. She pockets the money, stands, and disappears into the night. Back to the work, back to the noise, back to the math that never adds up but still demands to be done. Nightfall doesn't bring peace here, it brings business. The main street hums with noise, boots on wooden planks, glass clinking, saloons erupting with hollers that could mean a joke, a fight, or both. But behind all that noise, behind the flickering gaslights and the puffs of cigar smoke, there's something quieter, darker, something the girls try not to talk about too much, even to each other. You see it in the way they stretch their necks to glance at their reflection, how they check their wrists for new rashes, how they sip odd-smelling tonics from brown glass bottles when they think no one's looking. Disease. It's the silent customer, the one that never knocks but always finds its way in. Tonight you follow Clara, one of the more elegant girls from the parlour house, as she makes her way to the back room, past the velvet furniture and perfumed air. There, she meets a travelling doctor. Not a real one, she whispers, but the best they've got. He's set up on a crate with a small black bag that smells like rust and cloves. One by one, the women come in for a quick check. Throat, eyes, underarms, and the rest. He barely talks, just grunts, pokes, and prescribes. Some girls he clears, others he tells to rest a few days, which is code for don't spread whatever you've got. The truth is that sexually transmitted infections were everywhere in the Wild West. Gonorrhea, syphilis, chancroid, diseases with names that sound like curses, treatments raised from scary to deadly, mercury rubs, arsenic pills, herbal teas that did nothing, and painful injections of who knows what. And if you were poor, you didn't get a doctor, you got advice from the girl next door. Sometimes it helped, often it didn't. Here's your historical fact. By the late 1800s, some larger towns like San Francisco and Butte, Montana had unofficial public health routines for prostitutes. Women were inspected weekly, often by corrupt or unqualified doctors, and if found to be infected, were locked away in small hospital rooms until they were clean again. These policies weren't about protecting the women, they were about protecting the men who paid for them. One woman you meet, Josie, keeps a tin of sulphur powder under her mattress. "I take a pinch every morning," she says. "Don't know if it works, but I'm still standing." Her fingers are yellow from tobacco and something stronger. She laughs when you ask about symptoms. "If I wake up with everything still attached and nothing dripping, I call it a win." Then there's the other danger, pregnancy. Contraception exists, but it's unreliable and not exactly safe. Some use animal gut condoms if they can afford them. Others rely on douches made from vinegar or carbolic acid. Yes, acid. It burns. One girl describes it like cleaning yourself with fire. And when those fail, they turn to desperate measures. Herbs that induce miscarriage, risky procedures performed by midwives with shaking hands, or back alley abortions with horrifying outcomes. You meet Annie, who once worked in a high-end house until she got pregnant. The madam gave her two choices, get rid of it or get out. She chose to keep the child, moved to the cribs, and now works when she can, nursing her baby between clients. "I keep him under the bed in a basket," she says, not ashamed, just tired. "He sleeps through most of it." A quirky fact you overhear. In some towns, brothels had makeshift nurseries. The babies were fed goat's milk and kept in back rooms, tended to by older prostitutes or retired madams. These weren't places of warmth, just survival zones, where crying was silenced quickly and diapers were washed in cold, dirty basins. Yet oddly, these children were often healthier than street orphans. At least here, they were fed. But sometimes, when the diseases hit hard, even the strongest fade. You help carry a woman named Dell down the stairs one evening. Her skin is pale, her breath rattling. No one wants to say it, but they all know. Syphilis, third stage, the shaking hands, the memory loss, the hallucinations. She thinks you're her brother, keeps asking you to fetch her a ribbon she lost 10 years ago. No one knows what to do. There's no real cure, just time, and not much of it. That's the thing about working in a world where bodies are currency. Once yours starts to break down, the market doesn't wait. Girls with scars, tremors, or illness get pushed out. Some find charity in the arms of a former client. Others fade into the fringes of the town, living off scraps or turning to drink and opium to dull what's coming. The scholarly argument here gets messy. Some historians insist that the women in brothels received better medical care than many married women of the time. After all, there was a system, if you can call it that. Others argue that the system existed purely to keep them profitable. Once a woman became too sick, she was discarded like an empty bottle. Both sides are right and wrong. The care was real. The concern, not so much. You sit on the back steps of the brothel, watching the moonrise bleed into the dusty hills. Clara sits beside you, emoting slowly. She pulls her shawl tighter. You know what the worst part is, she says. It's not dying. It's knowing you'll die and no one will care. Not really. The girls will remember. Maybe the madam, but out there, she nods toward the town, they won't even blink. You don't have anything to say to that, and she doesn't expect you to. Inside, the piano starts up again. Business doesn't stop. The girls fix their hair, check their faces in chipped mirrors, sip whatever's strong enough to get them through the next few hours. Life goes on, even when it's falling apart. You walk back into the noise, the light, the perfume-soaked chaos. The same doors open, the same clients arrive, and yet somewhere behind every curtain, every giggle, every flicker of gaslight tweed, there's a shadow. Not the kind you see, the kind that waits. You hear the bell at the sheriff's office long before you see who it's meant for. A dull clang, heavy and impatient, followed by the shuffle of boots and the low grumble of a deputy who's too sober for this hour. It's just past sundown, and the air still clings to the last heat of the day. You follow the sound around the corner, and there she is, Delilah, or at least that's what they call her now, hair mussed, lips swollen, dress torn at the sleeve. She stands with her arms crossed and her chin tilted defiantly upward, staring down a man twice her size like he's the one who should be embarrassed. The sheriff doesn't look at her, just mutters something about disturbing the peace and tosses her a filthy blanket like it's a gift. The deputy waves you off when you ask what happened. Bar fight, he says. She got mouthy. But then another girl, Lisa from the cribs, leans in and mutters the real story. A drunk client refused to pay. When Delilah pressed him, he hit her. She hit back. Sheriff arrested her for the bruises she left behind. Welcome to justice in the Wild West. You decide to stay close, lean against the post outside the jailhouse and watch. Because you've started to realize something, the law here is not blind. It squints, smirks, and turns away, especially when it comes to the women who work at night. Here's your historical fact. In many frontier towns, the legal system relied heavily on fines and arrests from the red light districts. Not to clean them up, oh no, but to extract money from them. Prostitutes were arrested on vague charges like lewd conduct or public nuisance, fined heavily, and then released, only to be picked up again the following week. It was a revolving door of extortion, not enforcement, and it kept city budgets padded without having to raise taxes on the respectable folk. Some towns even made it official. In places like Deadwood and Tombstone, prostitutes were required to register with the local marshal and pay monthly fees. For the privilege of working, they paid the same men who might arrest them the next day. It was legal protection, but in the shadiest sense, because it could be revoked any time for any reason. The law didn't keep them safe, it just kept score. The sheriff here isn't the worst, you're told. At least he doesn't get too handsy. But the deputy, that's another story. Liza tells you in a low voice how he likes to inspect the cribs now and then. Pretends he's checking for licenses, but always seems to linger. She says he smells like chewing tobacco and sweat, and when he grins, it never reaches his eyes. That's the problem with policing vice in a town built on it. The line between crime and commerce gets real blurry to real fast. Technically, prostitution is illegal here, or at least unregulated, but that doesn't stop the brothels from running or the madams from paying their fines in tidy envelopes. It just means there's a constant threat hanging in the air. One raid, one crackdown, one new mayor on a moral crusade, and everything changes. Girls get thrown into wagons like sacks of grain. Cribs get torched. Ledgers disappear. You ask one of the madams, Miss Evie, how she handles it. She smiles coolly, eyes sharp behind her pince-nez glasses. "I bake pies," she says. You raise an eyebrow. For the sheriff's wife, cherry, mostly, she's partial to tart. You blink, she shrugs. You learn quickly that in this business sugar goes further than steel. There's something incredibly calculated about the way these women navigate the law. They know which deputy drinks, which judge visits late at night, which preacher's daughter sneaks out to the cribs after dark. Knowledge is currency, secrets are defense. The madams, the workers, even the laundry girls, they're all gathering information constantly, not for gossip, for survival. Your quirky fact tonight: in some towns, brothels had better security than the banks. Madams hired private guards, sometimes retired outlaws, sometimes ex-lawmen, who enforced rules with their fists. One well-known madam in Denver had a brass knuckles-wearing doorman named Gentle Jack, who once knocked out 2 Pinkertons for trying to search the premises without a warrant. The case was quietly dropped. You visit the courthouse one afternoon just to sit in on a trial. Not a big one. Petty theft, 2 men arguing over a horse, but the room is packed. In the back row, you spot 2 of the parlour girls watching intently. You ask what they're doing there. "Taking notes," one says. "Never know when a man might end up on that stand, might help to know what kind of liar he is." Later that evening, you hear a story that sticks. A crib girl named Addie was murdered last winter, strangled in her bed, her meagre coin stolen. Everyone knew who did it. He even bragged about it in the saloon. But he was the son of a local cattleman, and Addie. Just a soiled dove. No charges were filed. The sheriff didn't even write a report. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about whether the legal system in frontier towns was truly lawless or simply deeply biased. Some historians argue that law enforcement did the best it could with limited resources. Others claim the entire system was a tool to maintain a male-dominated power structure that only protected those deemed worthy. After what you've seen, you're leaning toward the latter. Still, some women fight back, not with guns, though that happens too, but with cleverness. One madam forged a fake marriage certificate to protect one of her girls from arrest, claiming she was an honourable wife with a temper. Another bribed the town coroner to list a death as pneumonia rather than botched abortion, just to spare the girl's family shame. These aren't small acts. They're quiet revolutions. You leave the jailhouse after midnight. Delilah's been released, her lips still swollen but her pride intact. She walks down the centre of the street alone, shoulders squared, hair tangled and wild. No one stops her, no one helps her either. You pass a group of miners laughing on the porch of the saloon. One of them makes a crude comment as Delilah walks by. She flips him off without breaking stride. You turn down an alley and find the night feels heavier now, not because it's darker, but because you understand more. The laws here don't just fail these women, they use them, milk them for cash, silence them with shame, and abandon them when things turn violent. But still, they keep walking, keep working, keep surviving, because the law might look the other way, but the women, they never do. It starts with a glance, a quiet moment that passes in the corner of your vision as you walk through the market square. A woman in a brocade skirt, dark eyes lined with kohl, hair braided down her back in a style you haven't seen on any of the other girls. She's standing at a distance from the others, her posture regal, chin high, face unreadable. You follow the gaze of the men nearby. They're looking at her too, but not the same way they look at Clara or Lottie or even Nettie. This is different. Not just desire, curiosity, intrigue, maybe fear. Her name is Rosa, and she doesn't speak much, but everyone in town knows who she is. The sex trade in the West wasn't just about gender, it was deeply entangled with race, status, and brutal hierarchies. Rosa is Mexican, or maybe Apache. Rumours change depending on who's talking. One man claims she was a war bride, another says she fled a land dispute in Texas. None of it's probably true, but that's the thing. Women like Rosa rarely got to own their story. Others told it for them. You walk through the working districts of town, paying closer attention now. You start to notice how the cribs are organised. The front row is white women, mostly English-speaking. Behind them, in shadier alleys or buildings with boarded-up windows, are the women of colour. Chinese, Mexican, black, indigenous. They're paid less, protected less, and punished more. If the brothel has a back entrance, that's where they're stationed. Out of sight. Out of mind. Here's your historical fact. Racial segregation in the sex industry was absolutely enforced in the Wild West. In towns across California, Colorado, and Arizona, prostitutes of colour were either banned from white-owned brothels or restricted to separate quarters. Chinese women, many of whom were trafficked, were often kept in literal cages, guarded by pimps and owners who paid off the local law. Native women, kidnapped or coerced, were sometimes treated more like temporary property than employees. And black women? Almost never allowed to work in higher-end houses. They were confined to coloured districts, if they were allowed to work at all. You visit a crumbling shack near the river and meet Esther, a black woman who's been in the town for nearly a decade. She tells you she arrived with a group of settlers after the war, hoping to find work as a seamstress. When that fell through, she ended up here. I charge half of what the white girls do, she says, and still get half the clients. Most just want to watch. She looks at you with an expression that is not quite anger, not quite sadness. But when their wives leave town, she adds, they all remember my name. You sit with her on her stoop, watching the moonlight slide across the river. She tells you about the way she's taxed differently, how her landlord raised the rent on her room the minute he heard she was making too much, how she's been arrested twice for loitering on her own front step. I work the same job, she says, but I pay more to stay in it. And then there's May, a Chinese girl, no older than 15, with wrists like reeds and a soft voice that doesn't belong in this place. She barely speaks English. The woman who runs her crib does all the talking. Imported directly from Shanghai, she boasts, as if May is a crate of fine china. When you try to ask May a question, the madam steps in, flashing a warning smile. She's tired, she says. Come back tomorrow. You don't come back. Your quirky fact? In some towns, brothels ran advertisements in multiple languages. Spanish, Cantonese, even Bon French. The language you spoke determined the door you were allowed to enter. Some madams specialised in exotics, a revolting term used at the time to market women of colour as more adventurous. One ad promised, an oriental experience you'll never forget. The woman behind that phrase vanished 2 months after it printed. The deeper you go, the clearer the structure becomes. Even within this marginalised trade, there are layers of privilege. A white woman in a parlour house might be seen as tragic, misunderstood, even glamorous. A Latina girl in a crib? Exotic, dirty, disposable. Chinese girl like May? Practically invisible. And if something happened to her, if she disappeared, got hurt, fell ill, no one would write it down. The scholarly debate here is grim and ongoing. Some argue that prostitution offered women of colour a rare avenue for independence in a world that otherwise denied them work, housing and autonomy. Others point out that independence under these conditions is a hollow term. If you can't say no, if you can't leave, if you're not paid fairly, are you really free? Most agree that women of colour in the sex trade were doubly marginalised, first as women, then as racial outsiders. You walk through the Chinatown section of town at dusk. It's quieter here, and smaller, tucked away near the laundry and opium dens. The women who work here don't wear corsets or lace. They wear practical cotton dresses, sandals. You pass a small house with incense burning in the window, and for a moment it smells like jasmine instead of sweat. A man exits the front door, adjusting his hat. A girl peers through the curtain, expressionless. It's all too easy to pretend these women aren't here. They were kept out of the saloons, out of the census, out of the history books. But they were here, in every mining camp, every railroad stop, every tent city that rose and fell with the gold, and often they were the first to arrive and the last to leave. Back on the main street, Rosa stands by the general store, her posture still as perfect as the first time you saw her. A man offers her money, she turns away. Another offers more. She hesitates, then nods. They disappear behind the corner, quiet as ghosts, and in that moment you wonder, what does she see when she looks in the mirror? A survivor? A stranger? A woman with her own story, or someone still trying to remember it? You don't know, you might never know, but you're starting to understand that no story about the Wild West is complete without her. You see her in the market late in the afternoon buying potatoes with a worn coin purse in one hand and a quiet child holding the other. She looks just like every other housewife. Hair neatly pinned, dress modern, bodice and clean, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She even nods to the preacher's wife who's arranging baskets of apples under a canopy. But when she turns down a narrow side street, there's a shift in her walk, less guarded, more tired. She stops once, glancing behind her to make sure no one's watching, then slips through a faded green door between two silent buildings. You don't follow, not right away. You've learned to wait, to listen. And when you do finally knock on that door a few nights later, it's not as a customer. It's as someone trying to understand the things that never made it into the stories. Her name is Mabel. She tells you that after the child's father died, coughing blood into a rag for months until even the undertaker gave up, she took in sewing work, laundry, baking, none of it paid enough. So when the landlord suggested she could rent out the back bedroom, she laughed. And then, 3 weeks later, she didn't. It starts small, she explains. A man who offers to pay your overdue rent in trade. A knock at the door when the baby's already asleep. You promise yourself it'll be one time, then once a week, then only when things are tight. Then it's Thursday again and the knock comes as expected, and you don't even need to light the lamp anymore. Tonight's historical fact. While brothels and cribs dominated the narrative, many women in the West, married or not, engaged in sex work out of their homes, quietly, discreetly, and often without ever using the word for it. The census listed them as seamstresses, housekeepers, unmarried mothers, or simply keeping house. They blended in, lived double lives, and survived between the cracks of the known world. You meet more women like Mabel, a red-haired girl named June who walks 3 blocks every afternoon to teach Sunday school, and 3 more after dark to take appointments in her attic. An older widow named May who runs a boarding house and has a gentleman caller every Wednesday at 9. No one talks about it, but everyone knows. There's even a group of married women bound to drunk or absent husbands who secretly pool their earnings and pay one another's grocery bills. They call it the Thursday Club. You attend a meeting once. It's held in the back of a dressmaker's shop, no men allowed. They talk about the price of meat, whose husband hit who last week, and whether the sheriff's new deputy is discreet enough to trust. You ask if they feel shame. They look at you like you've asked if water is wet. We feel tired, one says. That's all. The line between working girl and wife gets blurrier the longer you look at it. Scholars still argue whether these women should be counted among the ranks of the sex trade. Some say no. They had homes, lives, husbands. Others argue yes. If a woman sells sex, no matter how discreetly, how else can we define it? The truth, of course, is more complicated. These women didn't think of themselves as prostitutes. They thought of themselves as mothers, wives, sisters, trying to get by in a system that wasn't built for them. And it wasn't. A married woman in the 19th century West had few rights. Her property became her husband's. Her wages, if she earned any, were legally his. Her body, his too. The law gave men the right to discipline their wives within reason, and few towns even prosecuted domestic abuse unless the bruises were visible in church. If she left him, she'd be shamed, likely lose her children, and have nowhere to go. So some women stayed, and others stayed married in name only. Here's your quirky fact. In certain towns, women who ran respectable businesses also offered unofficial services out the back. Massage parlours with suspicious hours, hat shops with backroom visits, boarding houses where male guests always paid cash. One saloon in Arizona doubled as a dry goods store by day and a discreet escort service by night. If you knew the right phrase, I'd like to order a bottle of sweet cider, you'd be shown to the back, no questions asked. But this secrecy came at a price. The danger was real. These women had no protection. No madam to watch the door, no other girls to warn them about violent clients. If something went wrong, there was no witness, no support. A man could rob them, hit them, even kill them, and the sheriff would write it off as an unfortunate misunderstanding, or worse, nothings at all. Mabel tells you she once had a man who came every week for 2 months. Quiet, clean, paid in full. Then one night, he brought another man. She said no, they didn't care. She woke up bleeding. The child slept through it, she says. Thank God for that. She never saw them again. She didn't report it. She didn't have the time. There's something haunting about how matter-of-fact she is, how numb. I know I'm not like the girls at the brothel, she says one night, staring into her chipped teacup. They wear lace, Smile for strangers. I'm not pretending. I don't dance. I don't sing. I just do what I have to. She sets the cup down, looks at you directly. But don't you dare say I'm not one of them. Because that's the thing, you've started to realize the boundaries don't matter. Not really. Whether she works behind velvet curtains or cracked kitchen walls, whether she calls herself a girl, a wife, or just a woman getting through the day, it's all the same weight, all the same math, and the silence that surrounds it, that's the thing that hurts the most. When you walk past the market the next morning, you see Mabel again. Same dress, same coin purse. The child still in tow, hair tied in a ragged blue ribbon. She smiles at someone this time, an old woman offering her a handful of radishes. She smiles like nothing's wrong, and maybe in this town that's the only way to survive. It's late, later than usual. The saloons have mostly gone quiet, save for a few stubborn drunks dragging out card games with hands too unsteady to hold their whiskey. The moon is high and sharp over the rooftops, throwing cold light onto the dust below. You're walking alone tonight, just trying to clear your head from everything you've seen lately, when you hear it. A scream, not the playful kind, not a giggle wrapped in pretense. No, this is the sharp gut punch kind, real, fast, and then cut off just as suddenly as it began. You run, boots thudding across the boards until you find it. One of the cribs near the edge of town. The doors open just as slightly, swinging on its hinges like it's confused about what just happened. Inside, you see her. A woman lying half off the bed, dress torn, face swollen. The man's already gone. Probably ran the second she stopped moving. Her name's Ruth. At least that's what someone calls her when a few of the other crib girls show up, rubbing their eyes and swearing softly under their breath. They're used to this. Too used to it. One of them finds a towel and presses it to Ruth's temple. Another whispers something about fetching Nettie. Says she knows how to fix a broken nose better than the doctor. No one suggests calling the sheriff, and that's the truth of it. No matter how many men pay for a woman's time, not a single one shows up when she screams. Tonight's historical fact, violence against prostitutes in the American West was not rare. It was a constant. Rape, assault, beatings, even violent murder. In towns with no real justice system, the violence was just another part of the job. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, the perpetrators were never punished. They were rarely even named. You sit with Ruth while she groans and curses and tries to remember what exactly happened. Her eye is already swollen shut and her lips cracked open like a split plum. He was sweet at first, she mutters. Said I reminded him of his sister. She laughs bitterly. Guess he hated her. You stay long enough to help get her into bed and make sure she's breathing steady. Then you step outside and lean against the wall, staring out into the dark. The sky's so full of stars it's hard to believe something this cruel just happened beneath them. The other girls are already disappearing back into their cribs. One of them lights a cigarette with shaking hands and tells you this was the third beating in 2 weeks. Last time the girl didn't wake up. No one wrote it down. They just cleared out her things and rented the crib to someone new. You think about all the doors in this town, how many hide bruises under bodices, broken fingers wrapped in lace, minds so worn down by fear that they stop looking for escape. Quirky fact for you? Some madams try to prevent this kind of violence by implementing private security systems. Alarms made from hanging bells, signals between rooms, even crude buzzers built into walls. One house in Deadwood had a pull rope system that rang a bell in the kitchen if a girl needed help. The kitchen girl then banged on the ceiling with a broom, but most of these systems failed because the men who hurt these women didn't care about noise. They weren't trying to be discreet. They wanted to make a point. You hear a story later from one of the girls in the parlour house. Her name's Eloise. She tells you about a client who liked to tie her wrists, call her names, slap her until her ears rang. When she complained to the madam, the woman simply said, "He pays double. Take the hits and keep your mouth shut." Eloise left the next morning, packed what little she had and caught a wagon east. That's the last anyone saw of her. Or maybe not. Maybe she's working under a new name in another town. Or maybe she's buried out there in the hills, a story no one bothered to finish. The scholarly debate around this gets messy. Some researchers argue that brothels provided more safety than street work or the cribs, that madams acted as protectors, house rules kept men in line, and the women had each other. Others argue that the brothels just created an illusion of safety, that violence was still common, just less visible, and when it did happen, it was managed quietly to protect the business. They're both right, it just depends on the town, the madam, the night. And then there's revenge. You hear a tale about a girl named Dahlia who waited 3 months before slipping arsenic into a man's drink. He'd put her in the infirmary with a dislocated shoulder and a punctured lung. When he came back, all smiles and apologies, she served him herself. He died in the outhouse. No charges were filed. The sheriff chalked it up to bad whiskey. Everyone else just smiled and tipped a little extra that week. That's how justice works here. Quietly, sloppily, sometimes with poison, sometimes with a broken bottle to the skull, sometimes with a whispered warning passed between cribs. Don't take the tall one with the green coat. It's an entire underground system. The women watch out for each other. They keep mental lists of dangerous men, share safe words with the bartender, send younger girls to hide when a known abuser comes sniffing around. They've built a kind of fragile safety net, woven from bruises and bad memories. You think about Ruth as you walk back toward the main street. Think about the look on her face when she realized no one was coming to stop it. No badge, no man with a gun, just a few girls with towels and shaking hands trying to patch her back together before sunrise. The saloon's still lit, still laughing. Music spills out into the street like nothing's wrong. And maybe that's the point. Nothing is wrong by the town standards. This is just life. Business. A shrug in the shape of a society. You look up at the windows and wonder how many more are sitting in silence tonight, counting their bruises, making lists in their heads of who not to trust, who not to let back in, who's never going to pay. And you wonder how many of them are asking the same question you are. How long before it's me? The knock is soft, almost hesitant. You're in the kitchen of Miss Evie's parlour house, sipping a weak coffee with 2 girls still in their nightgowns when it comes. A single rap, barely louder than a mouse scuffling along the boards. One of the girls, June, rises, glances toward the front parlour, and disappears. You follow, curious. Through the lace curtains you see a girl standing there. Pale, young, hair in disarray, she's not wearing shoes. The moment the door opens, she steps inside like she's being chased by ghosts. Her name is Agnes. 17 maybe. And she's just run away from a man she thought was going to marry her. Turns out he was already married, with 2 kids and a bad temper. When she found out, he called her a liar, hit her, and threw her out in the middle of the night. She walked 6 miles barefoot and ended up here because she had nowhere else to go. You expect the usual discomfort, distance, maybe even judgment, but instead June pulls her in gently, wraps a blanket around her shoulders, and starts boiling water for tea. Another girl, Nina, sets out a small plate of bread and jam. Someone offers her slippers. They don't ask questions, not yet. They just see her. That's your first lesson of the day. There's a strange, powerful kind of sisterhood in this house. Here's your historical fact. In many brothels and red light districts across the West, the women formed deeply bonded communities. While outsiders saw only competition and shame, the women inside these worlds looked after each other with fierce loyalty. They shared earnings, clothing, medicine. When one got sick, the others filled in. When one was hurt, they circled the wagons. And when one disappeared, they lit candles. You start to see it everywhere. A girl named Rosie has a coughing fit mid-morning and 2 others stop what they're doing to wrap her in shawls, fetch honey, and keep her talking to make sure it's not consumption. Another girl, Alice, sits crying softly in the hallway. She just got word that her younger brother died in a mine collapse back in Pennsylvania. The others don't press. They just sit near her. One hums, another places a hand on her knee, and they wait. That's all. But somehow that's everything. You learn quickly that when something goes wrong, the women don't turn to the sheriff or the doctor or the preacher. They turn inward, to each other. And it's not always soft. Sometimes it's tough love, and sometimes it's sarcasm and eye rolls and brutal honesty. But it's still care. June tells you about the time she broke down after her 3rd miscarriage, crying so hard she couldn't stand. It was Nettie from the cribs who came to her aid, carried her to a wash basin, helped her clean up, and sat by her bed the entire night. She didn't say a word, June says, just held my hand like she was afraid I might drift off and not come back. This is your quirky fact. Some brothels even had unofficial councils, groups of older girls or retired workers who advised the younger ones, helped negotiate prices, and warned against dangerous clients. Think of it like a union, except without any formal power. Just wisdom passed down in whispers and bruises. You attend one of their meetings, if you can call it that. It's held in the laundry room where the steam covers everything in a damp floral haze. The girls are folding sheets, sewing ripped skirts, and complaining about everything from foot blisters to broken hairpins. But beneath the chatter, there's strategy. They're figuring out how to get a doctor for one girl without tipping off the madam, how to pool enough money to help Lottie send for her sister, how to spread the word about a client who gave 3 girls rashes. The scholarly debate around this is complicated. Some academics argue that these female communities were inherently exploitative, that any sense of sisterhood was just a survival mechanism in a brutal system. Others insist that what existed among these women was real solidarity, a kind of underground resistance, quietly thriving in the margins of society. What's clear is that many of these women trusted each other more than anyone else in their lives, and that trust wasn't given lightly. You get a glimpse of this trust when the girls begin letting Agnes do small chores, sweeping, folding linen, fetching cups. No one pushes her into anything. They let her find her place. Some girls never recover from that first heartbreak, but others grow sharper, more confident, more alive. You notice Agnes laughing for the first time a week later. She's sitting with Nina, sewing a tear into a pair of bloomers and telling a ridiculous story about a rooster that chased her as a child. The other girls are roaring with laughter. Nina clutches her side and wheezes. "That poor bird," she says, "probably still traumatized." Later that night, after the lights are dim and the piano's stopped, you find Agnes on the back porch, looking up at the stars. She's holding a small silver hairpin, clearly old, probably belonged to her mother. She catches you watching and shrugs. "I thought coming here meant I was broken," she says, "but I've never felt safer anywhere else." You nod, not quite knowing what to say. She adds, "They call us whores, but they don't know what it's like to be held when you're shaking, to be fed when you're hungry, to have someone braid your hair just because it's gotten tangled." You think of all the so-called proper women in town, clutching their pearls, crossing the street, pretending not to see the girls in the windows, and you wonder, how many of them have anyone to hold them when they cry? The next day, someone sneaks a kitten into the brothel. It's tiny, mangy, all ears and attitude. The girls name it Whiskey and spoil it rotten. Agnes builds it a nest out of a torn corset and a handkerchief. "Even the cat gets more affection than half the men in this town," June jokes. And she's not wrong. You realise then that this sisterhood isn't just survival, it's defiance. It's choosing to care for each other in a world that would rather see them alone, ashamed and afraid. It's choosing softness in a place made of stone, and it might be the strongest thing you've seen yet. You sit through your first trial on a Tuesday, half drunk on yesterday's coffee and the kind of headache only a sleepless night and dusty wind can deliver. It's not held in a courtroom, not even close. It's the back room of the saloon, the one with the crooked floorboards and walls yellowed from years of pipe smoke. There's no judge in robes, no jury box, just a bartender pretending to be neutral, a few men pretending to be fair, and a woman standing with her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles look bloodless. Her name's Daisy. She's being tried for stealing from a client, a regular, one of the banker's sons, known for being rough, entitled, and the kind of man who thinks buying a woman's time means buying her silence. He claims she took $10 and a pocket watch. She says he never paid to begin with and tried to choke her when she asked. There are no official charges. This isn't real court, it's vigilante theatre. The man leans against the wall, arms crossed, smirking like he already knows the ending. And maybe he does. The bartender reads a chitament that was clearly scribbled minutes ago on a whiskey-soaked napkin. A few town elders nod gravely, as if this is all very serious business. No one asks Daisy what happened, not really. No one asks why she has bruises on her collarbone or why she's got a split lip. The only question that seems to matter is whether the banker's son is lying. And the answer, silently agreed upon by everyone in the room, is no. She gets fined $10. That's almost everything she's made this week. They tell her she's lucky, that it's just a fine, not a jail cell. That she's not being made an example of. She doesn't cry, just nods once and walks out with a stiff spine and fire in her eyes. Tonight's historical fact: in many frontier towns, formal justice systems were either non-existent or so deeply flawed that informal, street-level courts became the norm. Prostitutes were rarely given legal recourse. Instead, disputes, especially those involving money theft or violence, were settled in saloons, by committees of local businessmen, or even by mobs. Sometimes there was a sheriff present, sometimes not. Sometimes the women walked away, sometimes they didn't. Outside, Daisy lights a cigarette with a trembling hand. She doesn't speak, but you stand near her anyway, sharing the silence. After a while, she says, "You know what I stole?" My own time. That's what burns him up. He thought he owned it. She flicks the cigarette into the dust and disappears down the alley. The more you listen, the more stories you hear. A girl who was publicly whipped after refusing to sleep with a deputy. Another who was found dead in the river with her throat slit, and labelled a suicide despite the missing shoes and broken fingernails, and no one questioned it. Not seriously, because questioning meant caring, and caring meant challenging the whole system, and nobody had the stomach for that. You sit in on another hearing a week later. This time it's one of the madams, Miss Francesca, accused of running an indecent house, too close to the school. Never mind that the school came after her parlour, or that she pays more taxes than the school board makes in a year, or that the preacher's nephew was just seen leaving her front door 2 nights ago. The case is dismissed, quietly. After a small envelope changes hands under the table, your quirky fact for the evening? Some towns had literal sin lists, public records of the women arrested for prostitution-related charges, printed in the local paper like a social death sentence. Others tried to keep things quiet, preferring under-the-table settlements. Either way, the law was rarely about justice. It was about appearance, about keeping the town looking just moral enough to satisfy the preachers while still milking the brothels for every cent. You find yourself asking over and over, where does justice actually live in a town like this? Is it in the hands of the sheriff who turns a blind eye until he needs a donation for a new jail door? Is it in the fists of angry men who take justice into their own hands when they don't get what they want? Or is it in the quiet, subversive resistance of women who keep their own records, whisper names to each other, and build networks of survival in the shadows? One night you hear about a brothel girl named Hattie who disappeared after a fight with a client. Everyone knew he'd done it. He was the last one seen with her. Her blood was found on his shirt, but he claimed she attacked him first, claimed she'd been hysterical, claimed he was defending himself, and with no body, no eyewitness, and no one willing to push it further, he walked free. A week later, he was found outside town with his boots missing and 2 teeth lodged in his throat. No one saw anything. The debate among scholars is constant. Was this lawlessness a byproduct of the frontier's chaos, or was it a deliberate choice by those in power to maintain control over women they saw as disposable? Either way, justice for these women didn't come with gavels. It came in the form of whispers, warnings, sometimes full as revenge. You find yourself at the graveyard more often now. The older stones, if they're marked at all, often bear only first names May, Sadie, Belle, sometimes just one who died alone. No dates, no causes, but the women remember. They always do. Daisy places wildflowers by Belle's stone once a month. She doesn't say why. You don't ask. You learn that even in death these women were often denied dignity, buried in potters' fields, unnamed, unwelcome in church cemeteries. One madam paid for her girls to have proper headstones, only for a group of respectable women to demand they be removed. Claimed they tainted the ground. Claimed it set a bad example for children. You wonder what kind of example is being set by a town that protects abusers and buries victims quietly. But through it all, the women endure. They get up, they work, they laugh, they scheme, they carry each other when no one else will. And if the world won't give them justice, well, they'll just make their own. It begins with a hymn, soft, quivering, a bit off-key, but sung with a conviction. You hear it just after dawn while the girls are still asleep and the town is just starting to rub its eyes. The song floats down the main street from a tent pitched near the edge of town, white canvas stained pink by the rising sun. Inside are benches, a crude wooden pulpit, and a preacher with a voice like cracked leather, pacing as he delivers the morning sermon on salvation and damnation. You duck in to listen, not because you believe, necessarily, but because lately you've heard the preacher's name whispered more and more by the girls, sometimes with sarcasm, sometimes with fear. Reverend Caleb Grant, a man on a mission to cleanse the town of sin, which, let's be honest, mostly means harassing women he won't look in the eye. He's not alone either. Over the past few weeks, a group of travelling reformers, missionaries, mostly women, have arrived in town with tidy bonnets and even tidier morals. They say they're here to help the fallen, to rescue the girls, to bring light into the dens of iniquity. But from what you've seen, it's less about light and more about control. Your historical fact for this chapter: beginning in the mid to late 1800s, religious reformers, many tied to the growing temperance and purity movements, swept across the American West, targeting brothels and sex workers in their campaign to restore morality. Some founded rescue homes and halfway houses, others lobbied for citywide closures of red light districts. Their impact varied, but their presence was deeply felt. In the parlour house, you see the shift happen gradually. First, a flyer nailed to the door. Free salvation meeting, leave sin behind. Then whispers of reform raids, where a sheriff backed by one of the more aggressive missionaries bursts in under the pretense of rescuing girls. One night, a girl named Polly disappears. The next day, a missionary boasts that they've brought her back to decency. When you ask where she is, no one can say. You hear that some of these rescue homes are little more than locked rooms, where the women are given one dress, a Bible and 3 meals a day, so long as they agree to labour without pay and renounce their unclean ways. Escape is difficult. The punishment for relapsing is isolation or expulsion into a world that no longer wants them. One girl, Tansy, spits when she hears the word rescue. She tells you she was taken in once by a reformer in Kansas City. They cut off my hair, she says, made me pray every night in front of a wall with a mirror on it, like I was supposed to stare at my own sin. After 2 weeks she ran, spent the next 3 months working rail camps just to afford boots. You meet one of the reform women, a Miss Hattie Norcross, who invites you to tea in her temporary parlour tent. She's polite, educated, soft-spoken. She refers to the prostitutes as our poor lost sisters, and her voice cracks slightly when she speaks of the injustice of their lives. But when you ask whether she's ever actually sat with one of the girls, listened to their stories without judgment, she hesitates. We cannot permit their narratives to justify immorality, she finally says. We must lift them up. You thank her and leave. Back at the parlour house, the girls are laughing over the breakfast, biscuits, molasses, strong coffee. When you tell them what Miss Norcross said, they cackle. June nearly spits her drink. Lift us up? Honey, I've lifted myself up off worse floors than she's ever stepped on. That's the thing. Most of these women don't want to be rescued. At least not like that. They want choices, respect, safety, the option to leave if and when they choose, not because someone decided their lives weren't holy enough to tolerate. There's a deeper scholarly debate here. Of course, Gaussians argue the reformers meant well and provided legitimate alternatives to women trapped in exploitation. Others suggest these efforts were more about social control, policing female behaviour, and erasing women's autonomy in the name of morality. Both are likely true in pieces, but the women themselves, they remember who listened and who didn't, and most reformers didn't. You hear about a reformer in another town who tried to shut down a brothel, only for the girls to gather signatures from every client in town protesting the closure. The madam framed it and hung it behind the piano. Your quirky fact: some missionaries tried to convert the brothels themselves. Literally. One rented out a building beside a red light row and set up shop as a church for the fallen. Her sermons included graphic warnings about hellfire, illustrated with lantern slides. She lasted 2 weeks before the girls surrounded the tent one night and sang bawdy songs so loudly she packed up and left the next morning. It's not that the girls don't believe in God. Some do. Some even keep prayer books tucked beneath their corsets or cross themselves before lighting a cigarette. But religion here has a sharp edge. It's rarely about forgiveness. It's about guilt. And guilt is currency that's already been spent too many times. On Sundays, the church bells ring. The preacher's wife passes by the brothel with her nose in the air. But inside the parlour house, June plays soft hymns on the piano while Alice hums along. Lottie places wildflowers by the window. It's not a sermon, it's not salvation, but it's sacred in its own quiet way. Later, you sit with Tansy while she threads beads into her hair. She tells you she's not afraid of hell. I already been, she says. This place ain't it. Not when we've got each other. She reaches into a drawer and pulls out a small stack of letters. Reformers, family members, strangers, all offering help, all demanding surrender. She places them into the stove one by one, watching them curl and blacken into ash. And you realise, as the smoke drifts up the flue, that the most dangerous fire isn't the one outside threatening to burn the brothel down. It's the quiet one in here, burning every time a woman chooses her own salvation. The first time you meet her, she's drinking champagne from a cut-glass flute and wearing a dress so encrusted with beads it probably weighs more than she does. She's seated in a red velvet chair, legs crossed neatly, a jewelled cigarette holder balanced between her fingers like a wand. Around her, The parlour glows golden, gaslights reflecting off mirrors, lace curtains pulled wide, the piano playing something slow and expensive in the background. Everyone who passes her lowers their voice. Some bow their heads. Even the madam offers her a rare, respectful nod. Her name is Miss Calla. No last name. Just Calla, like the lily. And if you didn't know better, you'd think she owned the place. She doesn't, technically, but then again, ownership means little here. What matters is influence, presence, and the sheer gravitational pull of a woman who's learned to turn her survival into spectacle. She doesn't walk through a room, she floats. Every man glances, every woman watches, and Calla sees everything without looking directly at anything. You've heard of her before in that half-mythological way people talk about ghosts or wild horses. The girl who arrived with nothing and rose to become the most expensive, most requested, most untouchable woman in 3 counties. There are stories, of course, that she once turned down a railroad tycoon, that she helped broker a mining deal over champagne and caviar, that she charges $10 just to be in the same room with her, and 20 more if you want her to laugh at your jokes. Here's your historical fact. Some women in the sex trade during the Wild West rose to a kind of celebrity status. Known as courtesans or fancy girls, they moved in elite circles, entertained powerful men, and wielded influence far beyond their so-called shameful profession. They were often educated, multilingual, stylish, and politically savvy. They weren't just admired, they were feared. Calla invites you to a party. You assume it'll be another crowded room filled with smoke and cheap wine. But no, this is something else. A private salon in the upstairs suite, only a dozen guests allowed, and everyone is dressed like they're meeting royalty. The girls have curled their hair, pinned roses behind their ears. The men are on their best behaviour, their spurs polished, their collars starched. There's champagne, real caviar, imported music sheets from New York. And at the centre of it all, Calla, hosting like a duchess in exile. She makes jokes in French, quotes poetry, pours drinks like a seasoned diplomat. When a drunken cattleman stumbles too close, she smiles coolly and says, "Do you know how easily I could ruin you?" He sobers instantly. One man, Judge Harlan, pulls you aside and confesses he once offered to leave his wife and fortune for her. Calla declined. "Said she preferred her own name on her accounts," he murmurs, almost fondly. "Damn woman, probably has more money than the bank." And she might. That's your quirky fact tonight. Courtesans often earned so much they were able to invest in land, open businesses, and even fund civic projects. One woman in San Francisco bought an entire block of property and leased it back to the city. Another in New Orleans lent money to steamship companies. In one case, a courtesan owned more real estate than the town mayor, who also happened to be her client. But Calla's power doesn't just come from money, it comes from her control. She chooses her clients, her hours, her name, and her past. No one really knows. Some say she was a schoolteacher. Others claim she fled a southern plantation. Some think she killed a man in another state. She lets the stories swirl like perfume. There's scholarly debate about these women. Were they liberated icons, or were they simply better compensated victims of the same system? Some argue that courtesans like Calla leveraged the only power available to them in a patriarchal world. Others say they were exceptions, rarities that shouldn't distract from the broader exploitation. Still, their existence complicates any clean narrative. They were both, neither, something entirely their own. You spend more time around Calla and slowly she lets you see the cracks. One night after the last guest stumbles out and the piano finally goes quiet, she invites you to stay, just the two of you sipping flat champagne in silence. She slips off her heels, rubs her sore ankles, and leans back against the armchair like she's been carrying the town on her shoulders. "I was 14 when I learned how to lie well enough to be believed," she says, eyes half closed. "And 17 when I realised that the best lie of all was pretending to be the woman they already imagined." You ask her if she's happy. She laughs, but there's no humour in it. "Happy? No. I'm tired, but I'm free, and that's more than I ever thought I'd be." She tells you she keeps all her earnings in a safe beneath the floorboards, that she's bought a small plot of land near Denver, that someday she'll leave the dress, the perfume, the name Calla and become someone else entirely. She doesn't know who yet. "Maybe a beekeeper," she says, grinning. "Maybe a ghost." Later that week, you see her on the balcony, watching the town wake up. She holds a cup of coffee in one hand and waves lazily at a group of miners passing below. They tip their hats. One calls out, "Morning, Miss Caller," like she's the mayor's wife. And maybe she is, in every way that matters. But you also notice the tension behind her smile, the way her shoulders stay tight, the way her fingers clutch the cup too hard. Because even when you sit on a velvet throne, you still have to watch your back, in a town that only loves you when you're profitable. You hear them before you see them, laughter echoing from the far end of town, sharper, more defiant than the usual drunken drawl of cowboys spilling from the saloon. It's late, and the streets are mostly empty except for the stray horses tied up outside the general store and a man snoring against a whiskey barrel. But this laughter feels different, alive, intentional. It's coming from a narrow alley behind the millinery shop, half hidden by laundry lines and the flicker of gaslight from a window upstairs. You turn the corner and spot them, a group of women sitting in a circle on overturned crates, sipping from tin cups and passing a battered harmonica between them. One is dressed in a waistcoat and trousers, her dark hair tucked under a gambler's hat. Another leans comfortably into her lap, long legs draped in a pair of trousers clearly cut for a man. No corsets, no curls, no false voices, just themselves. They see you, and the laughter hushes, but only for a moment. The one in the waistcoat raises a brow and gestures casually. "You lost, sweetheart?" she asks, voice low and smooth as molasses. You smile, shake your head. "Just curious." She snorts. "Aren't you all?" And that's how you meet Jules and Frankie. They're not like the other women you've spent time with in town, or maybe they are, and it's just that no one ever pointed it out before. They don't hide, don't play pretend. Jules, who was born Julia but hasn't used that name since she left Missouri, wears her boots like armor. Frankie has the easy charm of someone who knows exactly what people say about her and enjoys making them say it louder. Here's your historical fact. The sex trade in the American West wasn't just occupied by cisgender women. It also included people we might now understand as transgender, non-binary, homo, and queer. Though rarely recorded by name, historical traces remain: arrest reports, newspaper clippings, personal items, all pointing to individuals who lived outside the rigid gender expectations of their time. Some were assigned female at birth and lived as men working alongside cowboys and railroad crews. Others lived as women in red light districts, often under scrutiny or danger, but defiantly themselves. Jules tells you they came west because it was the only place big enough for them to disappear. Back east they call you a sin, they say, tipping their hat back. Out here they just call you crazy, and crazy gets you a little more room to breathe. You ask them what work looks like, and the answers are complicated. Jules sometimes takes clients, only the ones who ask politely, pay up front, and understand that things won't go as expected. Frankie doesn't. "I flirt for tips and break hearts," she says. "But I'm nobody's fantasy." They live above the blacksmith shop in a rented room with a cracked window and a view of the stock pens. It smells like soot and horse sweat, but it's theirs. No one checks on them, no one dares. Still, they aren't always left alone. They tell you stories of men who came just to mock, to threaten. Women, too, who cross the street at the sight of them. Jules carries a knife at all times. Frankie keeps a pistol under her pillow. "We're not waiting to be rescued," she says. "We're waiting to be left the hell alone." You sit with them again the next night, listening as they joke with a young boy named Eli who used to go by Eliza. Eli works in the cribs now, quiet, nervous, still learning how to spit on the ground and not get caught crying. Jules teaches him how to play poker. Frankie helps him bind his chest with strips of linen. "Tighter, but not enough to stop your breathing," she warns, with the tone of someone who's said it many times before. Your quirky fact. There are actual newspaper accounts from the 19th century of female husbands. People assigned female at birth who lived and worked as men, married women, and often passed completely undetected for years. When discovered, they were sometimes jailed for fraud, sometimes celebrated as curiosities, and other times simply allowed to continue living as they pleased. One such person was arrested in 1883 and released after the sheriff admitted, "Well, they ain't hurting nobody." The scholarly debate around queerness in the Old West has only recently gained traction. For decades, historians ignored or erased these figures, calling them eccentrics or cross-dressers, refusing to consider gender identity or sexuality as valid historical lenses. Now, more researchers are digging deeper, acknowledging that gender nonconformity has always existed, even under petticoats and wide-brimmed hats. You hear about a brothel in Arizona that quietly housed several queer sex workers, people who found community among the misfits, away from prying eyes. They created their own rituals, wore clothing that made them feel whole, and even carved out moments of joy in a world constantly trying to shrink them. It wasn't seer, but it was real. Frankie tells you about the time she was cornered by a preacher's son, furious that she dared to dance with his sister. He called me an abomination, she says, eyes narrowing. Said I'd burn in hell. She pulls her sleeve up to show a thin scar across her forearm. Guess he thought he could start the fire early. But then she grins, rolls the sleeve back down. I ain't burned yet. You start to understand that these people live in layers of protection, of performance, of hard-earned truth. They aren't asking to be understood, just seen, acknowledged, maybe even remembered. You ask Jules if they ever think about leaving. Starting over, finding somewhere safer, they shrug. There's always danger, east, west, wherever, but here at least I can walk down the street in boots and not hear my dead name. That's something. The next morning you see them again, Jules polishing their boots, Frankie coaxing the kitten, whiskey off a windowsill with scraps of bacon. Eli sits nearby, chewing onto a pencil, trying to write a letter to a sister who still calls him Lizzie. No one speaks for a while. It's enough just to exist together. And you realise, not for the first time, that the West didn't just attract outlaws and gold diggers. It also became home to those who had nowhere else to be, the ones history tried to forget, but who carved their names into the edges of it anyway. You start to notice the bottles first, tucked behind curtains, lined up on windowsills, hidden under mattresses, or half-beshum. Buried in the dirt behind the cribs. Some are elegant, labelled in fine gold script, imported from somewhere with a name that rolls off the tongue. Others are plain, cracked, sticky with residue, their corks long lost and their contents mostly guesswork. Some still smell like fruit, others like rot. At first, you think it's just part of the culture. Everyone in town drinks, right? Saloons are as common as churches, probably more so. The barkeeps know the names of miners, bankers, lawmen, and parlour girls alike. But soon it's clear, what's happening in the cribs and back rooms isn't about celebration, it's about escape. Lottie's the first one to tell you the truth. You find her behind the parlour house, sitting on the back steps with a glass bottle of laudanum balanced between her knees. It's not the pain, she says, not quite meeting your eyes. It's the noise inside your head, the part that won't shut up after they leave. She doesn't take a swig in front of you, just holds the bottle like it might answer a question she hasn't asked yet. Tonight's historical fact. Substance use, particularly alcohol, opium, and laudanum, was rampant in the red light districts of the American West. Prostitutes were often encouraged, even required, to drink with clients. Alcohol dulled pain, loosened nerves, and made the night bearable. But it also took its toll. Addiction was common, and overdoses quietly erased many names from brothel ledgers, never noted in public record. You learn that laudanum, essentially opium dissolved in alcohol, was as common as tea, sold at the pharmacy, the general store, sometimes even out of baskets by children on street corners. A bottle cost pennies and promised sleep, quiet, even temporary warmth. Most girls took it in small doses, just enough to blur the sharp edges of reality. Some didn't stop. Then there's the whiskey, not the watered-down, overpriced stuff they serve in the saloons, but the raw, backroom swill that burns like fire and makes you forget how to spell your name. You watch Rosie pour some into her coffee every morning, says it calms her hands, says she can't work if she's shaking. You don't ask why she's shaking in the first place. It's not just the women, of course. The men drink too, loudly, sloppily, violently, but no one writes poems about a drunk miner passed out in the street. A drunk girl, though, that's a different story. She's pitied, judged, rescued, or thrown out, depending on who's watching. You meet a woman named Tilda who once sang opera in Kansas City. She doesn't talk about it much now. Her voice is mostly gone, raspy from smoke and years of shouting over the piano. She lives in the attic of a rundown crib and drinks straight from a bottle of absinthe she guards like a child. When you ask what happened, she shrugs. One day I stopped dreaming about stages, started dreaming about ambivalence, thought the bottle would get me there faster. She laughs at her own joke, but you can tell she means it. Here's your quirky fact. Some brothels actually had opium dens built into them, not as a secret, but as a selling point. The full experience, one flyer advertised. Warm company, warm smoke. Chinese immigrants often managed these dens, though they rarely interacted with the brothel staff beyond business. It was a grim symbiosis, everyone earning, everyone numb. The scholarly debate surrounding addiction in the Old West often circles around the issue when it comes to women. Male addicts are romanticized as tortured geniuses or tragic heroes. Female addicts, especially prostitutes, are framed as cautionary tales. One slip into the bottle and suddenly their entire identity is rewritten. No longer survivors, just statistics. But the reality is far more complicated. You talk to the town's apothecary, an old man with nicotine-stained fingers and a kind face. He keeps records, sort of. He shows you a list of names he's scratched into the margin of his supply book. Most of them are initials, a few are marked with crosses. Girls who stopped coming in, he explains, never asked questions, just sold them what they needed. You ask if he ever thought about saying no, about cutting someone off. He looks at you like you've grown a second head. And then what? Watch them scream through the night? Watch them tear their own nails out trying to crawl back to peace? No, son, I ain't cruel. And he's not. He's just doing what everyone else is doing, trying to keep these women stitched together long enough to make it to morning. One night you help carry Nettie to her bed. She passed out cold in the hallway, bottle still in hand. Her breath reeks of bourbon and something darker. Lottie tucks a blanket around her, gently wipes the sweat from her brow. She'll be okay, she says, but the way her voice shakes tells you that she doesn't fully believe it. The next morning, Nettie wakes up like nothing happened. Jokes about drinking the pain off her bones, but she moves slower now, sits longer between clients. You start to count the number of women with bloodshot eyes and shaking fingers, and it's more than you're comfortable admitting. There's no rehab, no recovery programs, no sympathy, just more clients, more hours. More nights spent staring at the ceiling, trying not to remember the bad ones. Still, some of them manage to climb out. You meet a woman named Jo who stopped drinking 3 months ago. She's got the shakes, the headaches, the awful moods, but she's clear-eyed, determined. She walks every morning, drinks black coffee by the gallon. She even carries a little book where she marks every day she stays sober with a red X. That's how I know I'm still real, she says. Every little red mark? That's me saying no to the grave. But Jo's rare. Most don't make it that far. The town doesn't really allow it. And maybe that's what sticks with you the most, not the bottles or the smoke or the pills, but the fact that for so many of these women, being numb is the only way they've found to feel safe. It's not about forgetting. It's about surviving the remembering. It happens on a Sunday, one of those strange quiet ones where the street seems softer than usual and even the dust in the air moves slower. You're walking near the back edge of town, past the laundry lines and the sloped tin roofs of the cribs, when you hear it, a baby's cry, high, urgent, cutting through the stillness like a needle through fabric. You pause, instinctively looking around. Not many children live here. Not openly, but this sound isn't coming from a house or a schoolyard. It's coming from behind a row of sheds, where no one ever goes unless they absolutely have to. You follow it and find the door already cracked open. Inside, in a small room no bigger than a chicken coop, there's a cradle made from an old apple crate lined with scraps of velvet. A baby lies in it. Wrapped in a shawl too thin for the morning chill, rocking the crate with one bare foot is a girl you've never seen before. Young, barely out of girlhood, hair matted at the ends, circles under her eyes like bruises from a long war. Her name is Marie, and she doesn't say much, just hushes the baby softly over and over, in a voice that trembles like wind through broken glass. Here's your historical fact. Many prostitutes in the American West had children, some in secret, some out in the open, many in the murky space in between. The majority were born without the benefit of marriage, and for a woman already outside of polite society, that meant no help, no sympathy, no legal support. Some mothers kept their children close, hiding them behind curtains and under beds. Others gave them up to orphanages. And some raised them within the walls of the brothels in small hidden nurseries that ran on hope and borrowed time. Marie tells you she had the baby in that same room 3 months ago. No midwife, no doctor, just an older crib girl named Esther, who boiled water and told her when to push. He was purple when he came out, she says, still looking at the baby like she can't quite believe he's real. Didn't cry at first. I thought he was dead. But then, he screamed. You look around the room. There's a chipped teacup with milk drying in the bottom, a box of matches, A single boot. On a crooked shelf above the crate, there's a ragdoll missing one eye and a small cracked mirror. You see yourself in the glass for a moment, warped, unshaven, out of place. You ask her how she manages to work and care for him. She doesn't laugh, she just says, "I don't sleep much." She tells you that during her shifts, Esther watches the baby. Sometimes they trade. Esther takes clients in her room, Marie rocks the cradle. On good nights, Marie can afford goat's milk from the trader. On bad nights, she tries to nurse, even though her body doesn't produce enough anymore. "He's always hungry," she whispers. You find out later that baby's name is Thomas, but no one calls him that. Everyone just calls him Little Tom. He's not the only baby in town either. In fact, once you start looking, you begin to notice them everywhere. Tiny echoes hidden in plain sight. A cough behind a curtain, a cradle under a staircase, a stuffed rabbit perched on a windowsill, dusty but loved. There's a girl at the parlour house, Sadie, who wears her corset tighter than anyone else, and one day you realise it's not vanity, but she's hiding her pregnancy. She's 6 months along and plans to give birth and return to work within the week. "Can't afford the luxury of motherhood," she says, sipping from a chipped cup. "Just enough to bring her into the world and then find her a better one." Her plan is to send the baby east to a cousin. You ask if the cousin knows. Sadie snorts. "She will when the baby gets there." It's not that these women don't love their children. In fact, the opposite is painfully true. They love them with a desperation that claws at their throats. But this world is not made for mothers, especially not ones with dirt under their fingernails and bruises on their thighs. There are no playgrounds, no babysitters, no allowances. Just a crib room, a soft lullaby hummed between knocks at the door, and hope that tonight's clients are quiet. You hear a story from June about a brothel in Denver that had an entire nursery upstairs, 4 cribs, 2 rocking chairs, and an old madam named Lucille who took care of the babies during work hours. She called it the day shift. It wasn't legal, it wasn't sanitary, but it was better than nothing. Some of those babies grew up thinking Lucille was their mother, June says, and maybe she was. Your quirky fact? In at least one known case, a brothel had a child-sized door cut into the side of the building so that milk deliveries wouldn't alert the clients. The girls would sneak bottles in at dawn, tuck the babies into baskets, and pretend like this didn't exist once the piano started up again. The scholarly debate surrounding these children is quietly heartbreaking. Some historians argue that growing up in brothels exposed children to violence and neglect. Others suggest that these women, in spite of their circumstances, created fierce, loyal communities that cared for one another and their babies with more intention than the respectable families who abandoned unwanted children to overcrowded orphanages. Either way, these children rarely made the history books, and when they did, they were usually defined only by who their mothers were. Back in Marie's room, little Tom has fallen asleep. She sets down the crate gently and sinks to the floor beside it, resting her head against the wall. "He doesn't have a father," she says softly, almost to herself, "but he has me. And maybe that's enough." You want to believe her. You really do. But later that night, you see her take on 2 clients in a row, one rough, one drunk. You hear the baby crying through the thin wall and wonder which sound she hears more loudly, the man's voice or her son's sobs. You ask yourself, not for the first time, why no one ever planned for women like Marie. Why no one ever thought that maybe the towns built by men with dynamite and whiskey would need something more than saloons and gallows. Maybe they needed nurseries, maybe they still do. You're sitting on the steps of the telegraph office, swatting flies with your hat and wondering whether the heat will ever let up when you see them. A pack of men, maybe a dozen, walking in from the East Road, kicking up dust and dragging their tired boots like they've just marched out of hell. Their coats are blue and grey, their hats mismatched. And their faces tell the story, war's over, but they're still carrying it. These are veterans, the kind who didn't get parades or pensions or anything much at all. They look around the town with hollow eyes and the hungry expressions of men used to taking more than they're offered. You can already guess where they'll end up before sundown. Not the church, not the barber. They'll head straight to the saloons, then upstairs, where the girls have already started hearing the boots and bracing for what that kind of pain brings with it. It's 1860 or 1868. Doesn't really matter. The war is technically done, but the country is still bleeding out. The West becomes a dumping ground for men with nowhere else to go. Men who fought on both sides, who lost brothers, limbs, farms and names. Men who don't want to talk about what they saw. Who don't want to be thanked or forgiven, just forgotten. which means, for better or worse, they end up here. Here's your historical fact. After the Civil War, thousands of soldiers migrated westward chasing work land or simply through the promise of anonymity. Many towns exploded in size practically overnight, and with every new camp, rail hub or mining settlement came the same demand: cheap food, strong drink, and available women. The sex trade surged. The ratio of men to women grew more extreme, sometimes 20-1, and brothels flourished to meet the need. You see the impact immediately. The parlour house is suddenly busier than it had been in weeks. The madam is pleased, at least at first, but then with the girls, not so much. The war has left these men strange, quiet, quick to anger, slow to smile. Some stare too long. Others don't want to speak at all. One girl, Rose, comes downstairs pale as milk, her dress torn at the hem. "He just cried," she says, "sat on the bed and sobbed like a child, then paid double." You see another girl, Callie, trying to coax a smile out of a one-armed Confederate veteran with eyes so haunted it's like they've seen every battlefield and carried every dead friend. He doesn't speak a word, just presses money into her hand and leaves before she can ask anything more. The girls start talking in code. They call the veterans the ghosts. Some are kind, some are monsters. Most are something in between. They show up with no warning, stay for a night or a week, then vanish again into the plains like tumbleweeds with bones. But it's not just the soldiers. Some of the women came west after the war too, widows, displaced daughters, freed women seeking any kind of future. The brothels, especially the cheaper cribs, became strange, sad melting pots for those the war had left behind. You meet a woman named Millie, a black woman who says she used to cook for union officers. Now she takes in laundry and clients. "This town's got no memory," she says. "Don't care which side you are on, just care that you're quiet." Your quirky fact for the night. Some brothels kept a ledger noting which clients had been soldiers. It wasn't for patriotism, it was for protection. Many of them were prone to nightmares, sudden outbursts, or bursts of violence. Some came in high on morphine or whiskey. A few came in bleeding from old wounds reopened by hard work and harder sleep. The ledgers were a quiet warning. Tread carefully. You ask one of the girls, Tansy, if she ever refuses service to a man she thinks is dangerous. She laughs dryly. "Sweetheart, if I refused every man I thought might hurt me, I'd starve to death." Still they manage. They watch each other. They take note of new boots, missing fingers, scars that look too fresh to be old. When a man comes in twitching from phantom pain, they rub his back and let him scream into the pillow. When he comes in silent, they light a candle and wait. You learn that the girls have their own form of triage. They've patched bullet wounds, stitched torn flesh, pulled teeth, even drained abscesses. Lottie once set a broken nose with 2 popsicle sticks and a prayer. They call it field medicine. The men call it miraculous, but it's just necessity, same as always. There's scholarly disagreement about how much agency these women had during this period. Some say the influx of soldiers gave them leverage, higher prices, more clients, a chance to negotiate. Others argue it increased the danger tenfold, especially for women of colour, whose complaints were less likely to be believed. And others still believe the war merely revealed what was already true, that the sex trade was built on the trauma of a society always at war with itself. Late one night you talk with Jules from the cribs. He's sitting on the back step smoking a cigarette and watching the stars. "I served," he says quietly. You glance at him, surprised. "Back east, blue uniform. They didn't ask questions about what I was, not until after." You ask what happened. "They stopped paying me," he says simply. "Said I wasn't a real man. Then they stopped feeding me. Then they stopped seeing me." He takes a drag and exhales. "So I came west, started over, told everyone I was born this way." You don't say anything for a long time. That's the other truth about war. It doesn't end just because someone signs a paper. It leaks into every crack, every doorway, every room where someone waits to be held like they still belong in a body. The women here feel it. They live it. They carry pieces of bold men who can't carry themselves anymore. And when morning comes, they dress in silence, light the lamps, open the doors, and wait for the next wave of ghosts to arrive. You wake to the sound of boots crunching gravel outside the parlour house. Not hurried, not drunk, but purposeful. Heavy steps that mean business. You press your face to the window just in time to see a man in a crisp vest, gold pocket watch gleaming in the morning sun, walking up the street like he owns the dust it was built on. Behind him trail 2 other men, both dressed better than the average townsfolk. One carries a ledger, the other a clipboard. They aren't here for a drink. They're here to count things, sign things, promise things. You recognise them for what they are almost immediately. Politics in pressed collars, reformers, yes, but with checkbooks instead of Bibles. You trail them quietly, watching as they make stops, first at the mayor's office, then the bank, then the saloon where Miss Evie does her business out of a side parlour. They stay a while. There's handshaking, tense laughter, and something is brewing. Later that day, Miss Evie gathers her girls in the dining room. She tells them that a vote is coming, a real one. With ballots and everything, some are excited, others are wary. Evie's tone is dry as old parchment. They want a new sheriff, she says, one who cleans things up. The old one's gotten soft, takes our bribes and leaves us alone. This new one? They say he's got a moral compass. You've been around long enough to know that nothing good comes from a man with a compass that only points in one direction. But here's where the story shifts. Because instead of wringing their hands or shrinking into the wallpaper, the women get busy. And that's your historical fact for the night. Some madams and brothel owners in the American West weren't just powerful, they were political. They influenced elections, bribed officials, bankrolled city infrastructure, and in rare cases, ran for office themselves. In towns where taxes from brothels and saloons funded public works, local officials often had to balance morality with financial survival. Many chose the money. Miss Evie is no amateur. She sends Rosie to sweet-talk the notary. June is tasked with writing a persuasive letter to the editor of the local rag. Eloise, with her perfect penmanship and knack for backroom deals, drafts a donation pledge to the school board, anonymously of course. By the time the week is out, the madam has made it known. If you want to keep the street lamps burning and the town water flowing, you'd best remember who's really paying the bills. But it doesn't stop there. Lottie pulls out an old green dress, mends the hem, and goes door to door under the guise of fundraising for a children's charity. At each house, she leaves behind a folded leaflet. Vote against Proposition 3. Keep our town free. She smiles sweetly, thanks them for their time, and moves on before anyone thinks too hard about who she is or where they've seen her before. The preacher, naturally, catches wind of it. He delivers a fire and brimstone sermon on the evils of the female hand in politics. But the joke's on him. The women of the red light district have been pulling strings for years. They're just finally doing it in daylight. Your quirky fact: one madam in Helena, Montana, Josephine Eerie, known as Chicago Joe, was such an economic powerhouse that she single-handedly funded road construction and the town fire department. She used her brothel's income to keep the infrastructure running and wielded that influence like a scepter. When moralists tried to run her out, she threatened to call in her debts, including those owed by half the city council. She stayed. You ask Miss Evie if she's ever thought about holding office herself. She laughs, full and unfiltered. Honey, I already run this town, why would I take a pay cut to prove it? The scholarly conversation around women like her is still evolving. Were these madams exceptions? Outliers? Or were they part of a broader underground governance that propped up towns when formal systems failed? Many argue that the Wild West was far more reliant on unofficial leadership than textbooks admit, and in more than one town that leadership wore perfume and ran a register from behind red velvet curtains. You attend a meeting that week, unofficial, held in the back of the saloon after hours. It's a coalition of local business owners, including 3 madams, the barbershop's wife and the widow who runs the hotel. They talk numbers, voter turnout, messaging. One even says she's got dirt on the new sheriff's biggest donor. He's been paying for company, she says sweetly, but not through the front door. They discuss tactics the way generals talk about battle. They're calm, clever, cutting. One woman pours brandy into her tea and mutters, "Let's see how moral they feel with their pants around their ankles." By now, you're starting to understand that power here isn't about titles. It's about information, about who's seen what, who's heard what whispered after midnight, and who knows which man owes what woman for keeping his secrets. When the vote finally comes, the turnout is suspiciously high. Especially among the town's working men, the same ones who spent last Friday night upstairs with June, then came downstairs singing her praises. The preacher is furious. His pamphlets end up lining birdcages and outhouses. Proposition 3 fails by a comfortable margin. The sheriff stays, so does the brothel, and the next day the street lamps still light up at dusk. The school keeps its chalk and slate, and the town pretends, as it always does, that no one unusual had anything to do with it. That night, Evie toasts her girls with whiskey in porcelain teacups. To being underestimated, she says, may it always work in our favour. You sit back and marvel at it, how power here doesn't need a podium or a badge. Sometimes it wears a corset and speaks in a whisper, and sometimes it just lets the rest of the town believe they're the ones in charge. It starts with a letter. No fanfare, no messenger, no stern sheriff rapping on the door with authority. Just a thin white envelope slipped under the door of the parlour house like a secret someone didn't have the courage to say out loud. Miss Evie finds it during breakfast, tucked beneath her boot. She reads it once, twice, and then folds it slowly and slides it into her apron pocket. They're coming, she says, with a quiet finality that settles the room like dust. You don't need to ask who they are. Reformers. The real kind this time. Not just flyers and sermons and finger-wagging from pulpits, but women with clout, signatures, and the ear of the state. They've formed a commission. Committee for the Moral Uplift of the Frontier, or some sanctimonious title like that, and they're travelling town to town, shutting down red light districts with a mix of legal muscle, religious pressure, and good old-fashioned social shame. They've already closed down 2 brothels in Colorado Territory. In one case, the girls were arrested en masse and shipped east on a train labelled vagrants. No trial, no recourse, just vanished, as if they'd never been there. In another, the madam was fined so heavily she disappeared overnight, leaving her girls with nothing but debt and a few bruises from the cops who came to escort them out. Miss Evie calls a meeting that night in the sitting parlour. Her girls crowded onto couches, steps, and floor cushions, their hair still damp from evening baths, their faces drawn. We have 2 weeks, she says. They'll be here by the 1st of the month. You look around the room and see something you haven't seen before. Not fear, not yet, but weariness, the kind that sinks into your bones when you realise the fight might be bigger than you this time. Tonight's historical fact, the progressive era reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought sweeping changes to towns across the West, including aggressive efforts to abolish prostitution. Reformers, many of them women from eastern cities, lobbied for new laws, pressured local officials, and launched public campaigns to clean up frontier communities. Their intentions were often sincere, but their actions frequently left sex workers without shelter, income, or legal protection. The next few days unfold like a slow, painful unravelling. Clients drop off. Regulars make themselves scarce. One even has the gall to say, "I'd like to keep seeing you, just not where anyone might see me." Lottie throws him out, but her hands shake afterward. June burns every letter she's ever received. "Just in case," she says. Tansy starts sending money east again, little by little, to the sister she left behind. Eloise inventories her dresses like she's choosing what pieces of her life to carry. The girls in the cribs begin closing their curtains before sundown. For once, there's no laughter from the alley after dark, and it's not just here. The saloon owners are nervous. The bar keeps quieter. The general store raises prices suddenly, sensing the blood in the water. Even the sheriff, once comfortably indifferent, has started avoiding eye contact. Miss Evie, for all her calm, begins preparing. She calls in a favour from the telegraph office, sends off a coded message. You don't ask to whom, but 2 days later a man in a fine hat arrives from Denver and leaves a thick envelope in her hand. "She's lawyering up," one of the girls whispers. "Or bribing the right people?" Probably both. You ask her what she's going to do if they shut her down. "I've got land in Santa Fe," she says, her eyes unreadable. "But I'm not leaving these girls here to rot." That's your quirky fact for the evening. Some madams in the Old West became unexpected social activists. They funded legal defences for their workers, protested unfair arrests, and even wrote editorials under pseudonyms, challenging moral hypocrisy and calling out the exploitation hiding behind respectable faces. One madam famously wrote, "We take less from a man than his wife does, and we work for every cent." There's a growing tension in the house now, like a storm sitting on the edge of the horizon. You see it in the way Rosie snaps at her reflection while pinning her hair, the way Calla sits longer by the piano, her fingers slower on the keys, the way Marie clutches her baby tighter, as if bracing for a knock that might take him away. The debate among scholars on the Reform era remains tangled. Some say the closure of brothels was a moral victory, necessary to reduce crime, disease and trafficking. Others argue it simply pushed sex work underground, made it more dangerous, more exploitative, less visible, and more violent. What is agreed upon is this: the women were rarely consulted. Their lives were written about, studied, politicised, but rarely heard. You ask Tansy what she'll do if they really shut it all down. "Don't know," she says. "So maybe. We'll teach piano to girls who'll be told not to become me." She laughs, but it's brittle. "Or maybe I'll just get on a train and start over again. Maybe I'll change my name for the 5th time and see if this next version of me sticks longer." The train arrives 3 days early. A woman steps off in white gloves, a clipboard in one hand and a travelling case in the other. Behind her is a young man in a suit, his hair slicked back so tightly it looks like it's pulling on his soul. They don't even glance at the saloon, just head straight for City Hall. Miss Evie gathers the girls that night and tells them to pack light but not to panic. "We're not finished yet," she says, lifting her glass. "But if they want a show, we'll give them one." You've never seen the brothel cleaner. The brass gleams, the curtains are fresh, the girls wear their finest silks, Calla serves tea in china cups. They don't hide. They dare the reformers to step inside, and for 2 days they don't. They walk past, notebooks clutched tight, noses in the air. But the threat hangs like smoke. Everyone knows the deadline is coming. Everyone knows change is on the doorstep, and no one knows what will be left after it knocks. They arrive at noon, dressed like they're headed to a funeral, though not a single one of them looks like they've ever dug a grave. 4 women, 2 men, all wearing grey or black, muted tones to match their muted expressions. They walk together in a tight formation, like a flock of birds that don't trust the sky. The clipboard woman leads the way, lips pinched, and skirts pressed flat as if dust itself offends her. You hear someone in the saloon mutter, "The crows have landed." Inside the parlour house, everyone is ready. The girls sit with their backs straight, rouge perfectly dabbed, hair coiled into impossible shapes. It looks like a high society portrait, if you ignore the piano in the corner, playing a little too slowly, and the fact that 3 of the girls haven't eaten since morning from sheer nerves. Miss Evie stands near the entrance like a queen awaiting unwanted guests. When the reformers knock, she doesn't answer right away. Lets them wait, just a few seconds, long enough to remind them whose house they're entering. You're sitting on the stairs when it happens, when the doors open and the worlds finally collide. Reverend Caleb is among them, looking every inch the moral hammer he fancies himself to be. He doesn't meet anyone's eyes, just stands there like he's been holding in a breath for years. The clipboard woman introduces herself as Miss Eleanor Pritchard, chair of the Committee for the Moral Uplift of the Frontier. The name practically curdles in the air. Miss Evie doesn't offer her hand, just smiles. "Tea?" she asks, and so begins the performance. Here's your historical fact. When reform commissions came to town, they often conducted inspections of red light districts, interviewing residents, tallying statistics, and documenting the conditions for official reports. These documents would be presented to local governments to justify closure orders, but these inspections weren't neutral, they were theatre, preloaded with judgment, and rarely included the voices of the women themselves. Miss Pritchard walks through the parlour slowly, her eyes sweeping across the velvet drapes, the fine rugs, the glass lamps that have seen too many moths. She pauses at a painting of a woman bathing in a pond and purses her lips like she's considering whether it's immoral or just poorly framed. Calla is waiting in the reading room, her legs crossed, a book in her hand, the Iliad, if you're wondering. She looks up just once, then returns to the page. The young man accompanying the commission actually stares a bit too long. Miss Pritchard nudges him with her elbow. The questioning begins. One by one, the girls are led into the sitting room. Miss Pritchard asks about their ages, their health, their pasts. She uses the phrase fallen woman like it's a diagnosis. When Tansy responds that she was born fallen, right out of the womb and straight into sin, there's a silence thick enough to drown in. Your quirky fact? In some towns, reformers believed prostitution could be cured through labour. Women were sent to reformatories, where they made clothing, cleaned buildings, or cooked for pennies a day. If they refused to rehabilitate, they could be jailed under vagrancy laws. One reform home in Nebraska made the women recite purity pledges every morning before scrubbing the floors. Miss Pritchard doesn't yell, she doesn't scold, she simply jots things down, taps her pencil, occasionally raises an eyebrow as if collecting sins like stamps. When Marie enters, baby in her arms, Miss Pritchard's entire body tenses. He's well fed, Marie says before she can be asked. Clean too. Smarter than half the men I've met. Miss Pritchard writes nothing. The debate, historically, has never really ended. Were these reformers helping, hurting, or simply making themselves feel better? Some were absolutely earnest, deeply religious, painfully naive, trying to offer alternatives to women who had none. Others used reform as a tool for control, eager to reshape society in their own image. Either way, the women living in these brothels became data points, objects of pity, proof of a problem, not people with stories, agency, or dreams of their own. Miss Evie is the last to be questioned. She doesn't sit. Tell me, Miss Evangeline, Miss Pritchard begins, do you not feel any responsibility for the ruin of these women? Miss Evie tilts her head, thoughtful. I feed them, clothe them, pay them, teach them to read and write. Let them send money home to people who pretend not to know them. I give them a lock on their door and a say in who gets to come through it. If that's ruin, I'd hate to see what salvation looks like. Then the Reverend shifts. They leave shortly after. No one breathes until the door shuts behind them. Then Calla lets out a long theatrical sigh and mutters, I need a drink and a fire to dance around. But no one's celebrating because the worst part is the waiting. One day passes, then two, then a week. Every knock on the door feels like it might be the end. The saloon goes quiet. Even the piano sounds muted. Like it knows Joy would be suspicious now. And then, finally, the announcement. Miss Pritchard has submitted her report. 3 cribs condemned, 1 madam fined. A handful of girls arrested on unrelated charges, public drunkenness, disorderly conduct. The parlour house, however, is left untouched. No explanation, no fanfare, just nothing, like they weren't sure what to make of it. The girls gather in the dining room again, unsure whether to toast or to cry. I think, Miss Evie says, pouring herself a drink, we scared them, or bored them. Either way, we're still here. You realise that survival in this place is rarely about winning. It's about waiting out the storm until someone else finds a new crusade to die on, and knowing how to stay standing when they do. A dry wind rolls in from the south, the kind that carries dust through every crack and makes the curtains dance like restless ghosts. The whole town seems itchy under its breath, as if something's coming that hasn't quite decided whether it's a blessing or a curse. You hear the first whispers that morning at the general store. A new railroad spur is being built, and it's cutting through the hills just a few miles out. A whole new stretch of track, bringing with it fresh labour, fresh capital, and, of course, fresh trouble. It's not the first time the town's seen a shift like this. Every few years, some new industry rolls through, with promises as loud as a preacher's sermon. Mining, timber, oil, rail. They come and go, leaving behind busted knees and empty bottles. But while they last, they bring men. And where there are men, there are needs. It doesn't take long for the madams to notice the uptick. By sunset, the parlour house is buzzing. Lottie starts working overtime, adding more candles and ordering new linens. June plays her piano in major chords again. And Miss Evie? She's watching the tracks. Watching the dust rise. She's seen this before. Boomtown energy, she calls it. Dangerous in its optimism, loud in its urgency, and always temporary. Here's your historical fact. The expansion of the American Railroad during the late 19th century transformed towns overnight. Small settlements turned into booming hubs within weeks, only to collapse just as quickly when the tracks moved on. Sex workers followed these waves closely, often moving with the camps or setting up temporary brothels near construction sites. Their lives were as transient as the rail lines themselves. You ride out with Tansy and Jules to see the new railhead one morning just past the edge of town. It's chaos. Wooden planks, steel rails, shouting foremen, tents pitched in crooked rows. It smells like oil and sat and hot metal. The men are everywhere, swinging hammers, chewing tobacco, telling filthy jokes like they're trying to outdo one another in sheer vulgarity. And scattered among them already are women. You spot 3 setting up a tent with a red curtain flap, 2 laughing as they hang lanterns, the 3rd keeping watch. None are from your town. These are camp girls, Jules says quietly. They go where the tracks go, no names, no homes, just golden grit. You learn quickly that these women live rougher than even the crib girls. They work for less, sleep in canvas tents, and deal with men drunk on more than liquor. Fights break out regularly. Stabbings, too. The law rarely bothers to investigate. When a girl goes missing, it's just assumed she left, or didn't. You meet one, later that evening, a woman who goes by Nellie. Her voice is low and flat, like it's been packed in gravel. She rolls cigarettes with her fingernails and has a scar running from her temple to her jaw. This spell lasts 3 months, maybe 4, she tells you. Then it's up and gone. You make what you can, hope no one drags you into a tent you didn't agree to, and get the hell out before winter. You ask where she's going after this. She shrugs. Depends which direction the train's pointing. That's your quirky fact tonight. Some railroad camps were so notorious for their violence and vice that newspapers began referring to them as hell on wheels. Temporary brothels, gambling dens, and saloons would follow the camps from site to site, sometimes packed up and moved in a single night. One such brothel in Wyoming operated entirely out of a repurposed train car. Back in town, the tension thickens. Some of the crib girls see the newcomers as competition. Others see them as warning signs. The parlour house, with its velvet curtains and fine brandy, seems suddenly too soft for the rough crowd rumbling in with the rails. The newcomers don't care about lace or music. They want quick and cheap. And if the local girls can't give it to them, they'll go where they can. Miss Evie gathers her girls again. "We are not lowering our standards when she says, as if daring the room to challenge her. Let the rail camp have its chaos. We are not the chaos. Still, she begins to make changes. Tighter security. Curfews. One of the older girls, May, is posted at the door to vet clients. No one gets in without coin and respect. The message is clear. The parlour house isn't a tent, and these women aren't to be handled like rations. The scholarly debate on the railboom's impact is mixed. Some argue it created opportunity for women in sex work. More clients, more income, more mobility. Others suggest it increased volatility, broke community structures, and pushed the trade into more dangerous makeshift territories. Both views carry truth. The rail didn't just bring men, it brought instability. And sex workers bore the brunt of that whiplash. You watch as the town splits along invisible lines. The parlour girls stand straighter, speak softer, try not to draw attention. The camp girls are loud, fast, and unapologetic. Fights break out between the two groups. Miss Evie tries to keep the peace, but she can't control what happens beyond her door. One girl comes back bleeding from the lip, another quits altogether. But not all the news is grim. Lottie takes to the camp's edge with June, setting up a makeshift performance. They sing old ballads, trade stories for tips, and leave before nightfall. It's not much, but it builds something. One night Nellie visits the parlour house. She doesn't say much, just stands in the doorway and looks around like she's wandered into a different dimension. Miss Evie hands her a drink. They sit together in silence. "Do you miss it?" Nellie asks after a while. Evie doesn't blink. "Which part?" Nellie nods like that's the right answer. You realise that between these two women are decades of scars. Some visible, some not. They don't compare wounds. They just drink slowly and wait for the train to pass. And in the morning it does. With a scream of steam and a clatter of wheels, it rolls through like a mechanical promise. The town holds its breath. Then exhales. The boom has come. It will go. And the women, they're already adjusting the lace on their gloves. The flyer appears overnight, nailed to the side of the saloon like an afterthought, half curled from the wind by morning. At first glance, it's nothing unusual, just another notice, another town event. But when you get close enough to read it, the words hit like a cold slap. Citizens Forum, a conversation on morality, order, and the future of our town, all welcome, speakers invited. Below that, in fine print, hosted by the Women's League of Temperance and Public Decency, you don't even finish your coffee before heading back to the parlour house. Inside, the girls are already buzzing. June holds the flyer like it might combust. "Speakers invited," she mutters. "You think they actually mean us?" Miss Evie stands near the window, silent. She's reading the flyer with an expression you can't quite place, somewhere between amusement and wariness. "I think," she says finally, "they've forgotten who's been paying their library taxes for the last 5 years." The idea is ridiculous. Of course it is. No one expects a whore to speak at a public forum, certainly not in broad daylight, and certainly not as anything other than a cautionary tale. The girls are used to having their stories told about them, not by them, and yet... Miss Evie taps the flyer once with her finger. "We'll go." Tonight's historical fact. As the progressive era began to unfold, public morality debates became common in growing Western towns. Citizens' forums, temperance meetings, and women's clubs held gatherings to shape local policy and define a respectable society. Though sex workers were rarely invited, a few bold women crossed the line, standing up in public spaces to defend their place in the community. Their testimonies, when recorded, were often met with outrage or stunned silence. You help the girls prepare. Calla practices her speech at the kitchen table, twirling a spoon between her fingers like a conductor's baton. June writes hers in careful cursive, tears the first 3 drafts to shreds, then writes it again. Tansy says she's not talking unless someone else does first, but you catch her mouthing lines under her breath in the mirror. Miss Evie doesn't write anything at all. She says she's better off speaking from the gut. The night of the forum arrives with a heat that sticks to your collar. The church hall is packed. The front pews are lined with the usual suspects: preachers, school teachers, the mayor's wife, and Miss Pritchard, clipboard folded in her lap like a dagger made of paper. Behind them sit townsfolk in their Sunday best, sweating through starch and perfume, eyes darting toward the back pews where the parlour girls have slipped in. You expect a scene, you expect whispers, but for a moment, nothing happens, just the creak of the floorboards and the scent of beeswax candles. Then the Reverend takes the podium. He's everything you'd expect: stern voice, poetic fire, condemning sin in long, swirling sentences. He quotes scripture, names no names, but everyone knows exactly who he's talking about. Our town, he says, stands at the edge of a decision. Will we walk in righteousness, or continue to permit the rot beneath our feet? The crowd hums in agreement. Then Miss Evie stands up, and the room goes still. She doesn't go to the podium. She just turns to face the audience, her chin lifted, her voice calm. I pay taxes, she begins. I contribute to the town fund. I fund your hospital drives, your school recitals, your town clean-up days. I hire local. I buy from your markets. The girls who work with me, they put food on more tables than just their own. A murmur stirs, but she goes on. No one chooses this life out of fairy tale dreams, but many of us choose it over starvation, over abuse, over nothing, and we make it work. We make it safe for ourselves and for each other. Calla stands next, then June, then Tansy, trembling, her voice quiet but sharp. They talk about autonomy, about protection, about dignity. They tell stories, not salacious ones, not sob stories, but real complicated truths that don't fit into the Reverend's tidy sermons. And something remarkable happens. People listen. Not everyone, of course. Some fold their arms. One man walks out. Miss Pritchard looks as though she's chewing lemons behind her tight-lipped expression, but others nod, lean forward. A woman in the 3rd row dabs her eyes. The schoolteacher purses her lips but doesn't interrupt. Your quirky fact. In 1910, a woman named Julia Bulett, one of the most famous madams in Virginia City, Nevada, was posthumously defended by local citizens during a similar forum after her murder. They spoke of her charity work, her care for the sick during an epidemic, and her contributions to the fire brigade. Her legacy, they argued, was more valuable than that of the so-called moral men who tried to erase her. After the forum, the air is heavy with unsaid things. The parlour girls slip out the back quietly, without waiting for applause or condemnation. Miss Evie walks slower, her heels clicking with defiant poise. The next day, the mayor stops by the parlour house. He doesn't ask for a girl, he asks for Miss Evie. They speak behind closed doors for 20 minutes. When he leaves, he's paler than when he arrived. No new ordinances are passed, no fines issued. And a week later, the brothel street is added to the town's paving plans, a request that had sat ignored for 6 months. The scholarly debate about sex workers participating in civic life is only just beginning to scratch the surface. For too long, these women were imagined as outsiders, when in fact, they were often at the very centre of their communities, economically, socially, and sometimes even politically. They just weren't always seen, until they stood up and refused to be silent. That night, June plays something triumphant on the piano. A few of the girls dance. Calla takes her glass to the balcony and raises it toward the dark sky like it owes her something. You join them, not because it's over, but because for once they got to be more than whispered stories. They got to be heard, and there's power in that, quiet, steady, defiant power. The kind that builds a place to call home, even when the whole world insists you don't deserve one. You don't hear the news from the mayor, or the sheriff, or even Miss Evie. You hear it from the stable boy, a wiry kid named Jonah who smells like hay and adrenaline. He runs in breathless, cheeks flushed, boots trailing straw, and blurts out the words like he's not sure if they're a joke or a death sentence. "They found a girl," he says, "out by the tracks." The parlour goes quiet. No one has to ask what he means, no one has to ask which girl, because when a woman is found like that, it doesn't really matter where she worked or what her name was. What matters is that the town will pretend to be shocked, then pretend it had nothing to do with it. The girls gather fast. Miss Evie in her riding coat, Tansy still in her nightgown, June pale and furious. You ride out with them, past the camp, past the place where the tents end and the wilderness begins. The ground out here is dry and cracked, the brush brittle, the sky too blue for what you're about to see. She's there, crumpled near a boulder, one shoe missing, her dress torn to the waist, her face is bruised, her arm bent wrong, but the worst part, the part that sticks with you long after the sun goes down, is how young she looks. Too young. It's Nellie, one of the camp girls. And this is your historical fact. The murder of sex workers in the Old West was tragically common and rarely investigated with any real seriousness. Law enforcement often saw them as disposable. Clients who committed violence were rarely held accountable. When bodies were found, the response was minimal. A coroner's note, a shallow grave, and a town eager to forget. Miss Evie kneels beside Nellie's body and touches her forehead, as if closing invisible eyes. No one cries, not yet. Crying feels like a luxury in a moment like this. Instead, there's grim silence, resolve. "We're taking her back," Evie says. "Back to the parlour house. You help carry her, 4 of you, silent as ghosts, walking through a town that tries very hard not to look. When you pass the saloon, a few men tip their hats, awkward, guilty. At the sheriff's office, the deputy leans out the door but doesn't say a word. Back at the house, June finds a blanket. Tansy starts boiling water. Calla smokes on the porch, one foot tapping like a drumbeat. There's an electricity in the air, familiar now. It's the same one that filled the rooms before the reformers came, before the vote, before every time they were reminded the world could turn on them without warning. This time, though, they aren't waiting for permission. Miss Evie starts writing letters, not pleading ones, demanding ones. She sends one to the mayor, another to the paper, and a third to the sheriff. She signs her full name at the bottom of each, Evangeline R. Collins. No pseudonym, no initials, just ink and fury. That's your quirky fact tonight. Some brothel madames didn't just act as businesswomen, they became public advocates for justice. When one of their girls was murdered or abused, they raised hell. In Tombstone, a madam once hired a private detective to investigate a murder the sheriff refused to touch. In Deadwood, another took out a newspaper ad offering a reward for the capture of her girl's killer. She paid more than the town did. Within a day, the letters do their job. The sheriff shows up hat in hand. The paper runs a piece, short, cautious, but visible. A funeral's arranged, small and quick, but proper. Miss Evie pays for the pine coffin herself. No one from the camp comes. But the parlour girls line up behind the wagon as it moves toward the edge of the cemetery. June brings flowers. Lottie sings something soft, and Calla finally sheds a tear. There's no trial, no suspect, no justice, just a plot of land and a wooden marker that reads Nellie. Scholars still argue over whether the presence of brothels increased or reduced violence. Some say that by regulating sex work, towns created safer conditions. Others argue that the inherent stigma made women more vulnerable. But in cases like this, what's clear is that the world wasn't ready to protect women like Nellie. Not then, maybe not even now. That night, Miss Evie calls everyone together. The girls, the staff, even a few old friends from the saloon and the boarding house. It's not a mourning gathering, not really. It's something more dangerous. A reckoning. No one, she says, standing by the parlour hearth, gets to forget this happened. She proposes something radical. A network. Between houses, between towns. A list of dangerous men. A safe route for girls who need to move on. Maybe even a fund, small secret, for burials when it comes to that. We take care of each other, she says, voice low but burning, because no one else will. You see heads nod. You see resolve flicker like candlelight across every face. No one cheers, no one claps, but the silence is louder than any applause. And you realise this isn't just survival anymore, it's legacy. The next week, a stranger comes to town, a young woman, carrying a single suitcase and the kind of look that says she's run a long way. Miss Evie meets her at the train, offers her tea, a room, a job if she wants it, no pressure, just choice. The girl accepts, and in the end, maybe that's what all of this has been about. Not morality, not politics, not even reputation. Just the right to choose, to stay or go, to speak or stay silent, to live on their own terms. You walk through the house one last time, past the piano, past the portraits, past the bedroom doors with their delicate locks, and you think of everyone who's come and gone, the ones still here, the ones buried with names no one remembers, the ones who never made it off the train. And you whisper a silent vow, just like the girls do when they light their candles at night, not forgotten, never again.